Montana Territory, 1868. A lone figure rode across the wide-open prairie, where the summer sun beat down mercilessly on the tall grasses. The distant mountains stood like sentinels against the azure sky, their peaks still capped with snow despite the June heat. Austin Jameson pulled his hat lower, squinting against the glare as he urged his dun gelding forward. 24 years of hard living had left their mark on his lean frame, though his face remained youthful beneath a week's worth of light stubble. The letter in his pocket had brought him here, a desperate gamble for a man down to his last dollar. The Rocking R Ranch needed a foreman and Austin needed work, simple as that. The complications would come later, he knew, they always did. Not much further now, he murmured to his horse. The animal's ears flicked back in acknowledgement. Austin had learned young that attachments were dangerous in this untamed land. His parents had been among the first settlers in this part of the territory, only to have their dreams and their lives cut short by a harsh winter and harsher circumstances. At 16, he'd been left alone to fend for himself, drifting from ranch to ranch, hiring out his skills with horses and cattle but never staying long enough to form connections. A man relies on himself out here, his father had taught him. The frontier doesn't forgive weakness. That lesson had served Austin well, even as it hollowed him out from the inside. The West was no place for sentiment. You survived by keeping your guard up and your roots shallow. Love was a luxury for people in cities and settlements, not for men who lived by their wits and their strength in the wilderness. As the ranch buildings came into view, Austin straightened in the saddle. The Rocking R was larger than he'd expected, a sprawling main house of hewn logs with a wide porch, several outbuildings, corrals full of horses, and beyond them, pastures dotted with cattle. This was no struggling homestead but a thriving operation, which made the letter's urgent request for a foreman all the more puzzling. A young stable hand jogged out to meet him as Austin rode into the yard. "You the new man?" the boy asked, reaching for the dun's reins. Austin nodded, swinging down from the saddle with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent more time on horseback than off. "Austin Jameson, Mrs. Randall expecting me." "Yes, sir." "She's in the house." The boy jerked his chin toward the main building. "I'll see to your horse." Austin retrieved his bedroll and saddlebags, then took a moment to brush the worst of the trail dust from his clothes. Not that it helped much, his threadbare shirt had seen better days and his boots were worn thin at the heels. But he stood tall as he approached the house, reminding himself that pride was one luxury a poor man could still afford. The front door opened before he reached it, and Austin halted mid-step. Natalie Randall was not the weathered widow he had expected. She stood framed in the doorway, a vision that seemed transported from some eastern parlor rather than the rugged Montana frontier. 22 years old at most, with honey-blonde hair swept up in an elegant knot, revealing the graceful curve of her neck. Her blue eyes regarded him with a mixture of assessment and reservation. She wore a practical day dress of cornflower blue that complemented her fair complexion, though the quality of the fabric and tailoring spoke of wealth. "Mr. Jameson," her voice carried the refined tones of formal education. Austin removed his hat, suddenly acutely aware of his shabby appearance. "Yes, ma'am." "I am Mrs. Randall." She did not offer her hand or invite him in immediately, instead continuing her appraisal. "You've come about the foreman position." It wasn't a question, but Austin nodded anyway. "Yes, ma'am, got your letter in Billings." Something flickered in her expression, uncertainty, perhaps, or disappointment. Austin had seen that look before, when employers realized he was younger than they'd anticipated. He braced himself for dismissal. Instead, she stepped back. "Please come inside, we can discuss the position." The interior of the ranch house was as impressive as its exterior, polished wood floors partially covered with fine carpets, solid furniture that must have been hauled at great expense from the east, landscape paintings in gilded frames. Austin felt distinctly out of place, like a wolf that had wandered into a formal garden. Mrs. Randall led him to a study, gesturing to a leather chair before seating herself behind a substantial desk. The room smelled of beeswax polish and leather-bound books. "Your letter mentioned experience with cattle operations," she said without preamble. Austin nodded. "Worked ranches from Wyoming to Colorado. Started as a cowhand at 16, worked up to trail boss by 21. Most recently managed a herd drive from Texas to Montana for the Blackwell outfit." She made notes on a sheet of paper. And horses. We have a breeding operation here as well. Broke my first Mustang at 14, ma'am. Handled everything from draft teams to cutting horses. Something in her posture softened slightly. I'll be direct, Mr. Jameson. The Rocking R needs experienced leadership. My husband died 6 months ago, and while I've maintained operations, I cannot be both ranch owner and foreman. Austin waited, sensing there was more to the story. Several neighboring ranchers have made offers to buy the property. They believe a woman cannot successfully run an operation of this size. Her chin lifted slightly, a flash of defiance in her eyes. I intend to prove them wrong. Now Austin understood, Natalie Randall wasn't just hiring help, she was fighting for survival, albeit a different kind than his own. Why me? He asked bluntly. I expect you've had other applicants. A faint smile touched her lips. None with your qualifications who weren't also sent by those same neighbors to undermine my operation from within. Austin raised his eyebrows. That's quite an accusation. This is quite a valuable property. Her gaze was steady. 30,000 acres of prime grazing land, water rights to 3 streams, and a profitable horse breeding program. My husband built something worth fighting for, Mr. Jameson. Austin considered her words. The position offered stability he hadn't known in years, but it also promised complications. A young widow battling territorial neighbors, a ranch hands likely resentful of outside authority, and a woman employer who clearly had something to prove. The job pays $40 a month, plus room and board, she continued. You would have complete authority over the ranch operations, answering only to me. The salary was generous, more than Austin had earned in recent years, but something in him hesitated. He'd survived by staying unattached, by moving on when things got difficult or personal. This position would demand commitment. Your letter suggested urgency, he said. What's the immediate concern? Mrs. Randall's composed expression faltered briefly. Cattle drive to Fort Benton. We have 200 head to deliver in 3 weeks, and my previous foreman departed rather abruptly 2 days ago. Left her in the lurch, Austin translated mentally. Likely took a better offer from one of those neighboring ranchers. The men are restless, questioning whether the drive will happen at all. She leaned forward slightly. I need someone who can take command immediately. Austin nodded slowly. When would you need my decision? Now, Mr. Jameson, her blue eyes held his. The position is yours if you want it. Otherwise, I must continue searching without delay. Austin studied the determined young widow across the desk. Everything in him warned against entanglements, against committing to someone else's battles. The smart play would be to decline, to continue his solitary journey through the West. Instead, he heard himself say, I accept. Relief washed over her features, though she quickly composed herself. Good, you'll start immediately. The foreman's quarters are behind the main house. I'll have your things brought there. She rose, signaling the end of the interview. Dinner is at 6. We can discuss the details of the cattle drive then. Austin stood, hat in hand. Yes, ma'am. As she showed him out, he caught a hint of lavender scent, incongruous in this frontier setting. Natalie Randall was an enigma, a refined Eastern woman fighting to hold onto a rough Western empire. Austin suspected there was steel beneath that polished exterior. What he couldn't suspect was how his life would change in the coming months, how this job would challenge everything he believed about attachment and survival on the frontier. If he had known, he might have ridden away then and there. Instead, he followed the stable boy to his new quarters, already planning the cattle drive ahead, unaware that fate had just dealt him a hand he'd never expected to play. Natalie Randall watched from her bedroom window as Austin Jameson inspected the corral of horses, moving with the assured confidence of a man who understood animals. Though he'd only been at the Rocking R for 1 day, he'd already made his presence felt, spending hours familiarizing himself with the operation and quietly observing the ranch hands at work. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, trying to quiet her unease. Hiring a stranger had been a risk, but necessity had forced her hand. The cattle drive to Fort Benton represented nearly half the ranch's annual income. Without it, she might be forced to accept one of the insulting offers her neighbors had made. 6 months as a widow had taught Natalie harsh lessons about the realities of the Montana Territory. When Richard died, thrown from his horse during a thunderstorm, the sympathy of neighboring ranchers had quickly transformed into predatory interest. At 22, she was expected to sell and return east, perhaps to her parents' home in Boston, where she could properly mourn and eventually remarry. No one had anticipated her refusal. Certainly not her father, who had written suggesting she was being foolishly stubborn. "The frontier is no place for a woman alone," he'd admonished, as though she hadn't spent 4 years building this place alongside her husband. The rocking R wasn't just property to Natalie, it represented everything she and Richard had dreamed of together. The freedom from Boston's stifling social constraints, the opportunity to build something of their own, the future they had planned. Selling would mean surrendering that dream, admitting that a woman couldn't succeed where a man had. Below, Austin was now speaking with Ben Hodges, the most experienced of the ranch hands. Even from a distance, Natalie could see the respect with which the older man listened. There was something about Austin Jameson that commanded attention, not through bluster or intimidation, but through a quiet competence. He was younger than she'd expected from his letter, his handsome features unmarked by the hardship his resume suggested. But his eyes told a different story, watchful, guarded, revealing glimpses of experiences beyond his years. Natalie turned from the window. Tonight's dinner would be their first real conversation, and she needed to establish the proper tone. Professional but not cold, authoritative but not dictatorial, the balancing act of a woman in a man's world. She chose her gown with care, a practical evening dress of deep burgundy wool, modest and appropriate for a widow but still befitting her position as the ranch owner. Her golden blonde hair she arranged in a simple but elegant style, with a few soft tendrils framing her face. Richard had loved her hair, had often loosed it from its pins just to watch it fall around her shoulders. The memory brought a familiar ache, but Natalie pushed it aside. Grief was a luxury she could only afford in private moments now. At precisely 6 o'clock, she descended to the dining room where Mrs. Cooper, the housekeeper, was laying out the final dishes. The older woman had been a godsend these past months, providing not just household management but maternal counsel when Natalie most needed it. "He's cleaned up nice, Mrs. Cooper remarked with a knowing look. "Handsome young man, our new foreman." Natalie gave her a measured look. "His appearance is irrelevant, Mrs. Cooper. I'm concerned only with his competence." The housekeeper's expression remained knowingly amused as she retreated to the kitchen. A knock at the door announced Austin's arrival. He entered, hat in hand, his tall frame now clad in clean, if somewhat worn, attire. He'd shaved, revealing a strong jawline that complemented his thoughtful eyes. "Mrs. Randall," he greeted with a slight nod. "Mr. Jameson, please be seated." She gestured to the chair at the opposite end of the table. As they settled into the meal, Natalie observed how Austin handled himself. Despite the obvious quality of his table manners, there was a hesitancy that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable in such formal settings. "I've reviewed the herd records," he said after complimenting the meal. 200 head in good condition, though I'd like to cut out any that seem unlikely to make the journey." That seems sensible. Natalie appreciated his directness. "What else will you need for the drive?" 6 good men, provisions for 2 weeks, and replacement horses. The trail to Fort Benton isn't difficult, but it crosses Crawford's property, doesn't it? Natalie tensed at the name. "Yes. We have legal right-of-way, documented in the property agreements." Austin studied her, but Crawford might make things difficult anyway. "Joseph Crawford has made no secret of wanting the rocking R. He considers it an affront that I've refused his offers." She kept her voice level, though the memory of Crawford's last visit, his thinly veiled threats disguised as concern, still rankled. "And the other neighbors?" "Mason and Thornton." Natalie was impressed that he'd already learned the key players in local politics. "Thomas Mason is civil but opportunistic. He'd buy at a fair price if I were selling. Edward Thornton actively supports Crawford. They have business arrangements beyond ranching." Austin absorbed this information, his expression thoughtful. "And your former foreman, where did he go?" "Jim Phillips." Natalie's mouth tightened. "He gave no notice, simply left a letter saying he'd accepted a position with Crawford after 3 years of loyal service." The betrayal still stung, all the more because Phillips had been Richard's friend. His departure had shaken the other ranch hands' confidence, creating the exact instability Crawford likely intended. "The men are wondering if you'll follow suit," she added candidly. "Particularly after the drive, when you'll have cash in hand." Austin met her gaze directly. "I gave my word, Mrs. Randall, I don't break it." Something in his tone, a quiet intensity, made her believe him. Perhaps she was being naive again, but instinct told her Austin Jameson was different from Phillips. "Tomorrow I'd like to ride the property with you," she said, changing the subject. "You should understand the full scope of what you're managing." He looked surprised. "You'll accompany me personally." "This is my ranch, Mr. Jameson. I know every acre intimately." A slight smile touched his lips. "Of course. I meant no offense." None taken. Natalie found herself returning the smile before she could think better of it. "I've learned that I must frequently remind men of my competence." "I won't require such reminders," Austin assured her. "I've known capable women before. My mother kept our homestead running after wolves took half our cattle and nearly bankrupted us." A shadow crossed his face. "She was stronger than most men I've known." The personal revelation, offered without prompting, intrigued Natalie. "You speak of her in the past tense." Austin nodded, his expression closing slightly. "Both my parents are gone. 8 years now." "I'm sorry." Natalie recognized the familiar pain of loss in his eyes. "It's a particular kind of loneliness, isn't it, being the one who remains?" For a moment, the careful distance between employer and employee narrowed, two people recognizing in each other the weight of shared experience. Then Austin straightened, the professional mask returning. "About the cattle drive, I'd like to depart in 5 days. That gives us time to prepare properly while still meeting your delivery deadline." Natalie accepted the return to business matters. "Very well, I'll arrange the necessary supplies through our account at Prescott's Mercantile in town." The remainder of the meal passed in practical discussion, but something had shifted. A foundation had been laid, tentative respect perhaps, or the recognition of a shared determination to succeed against expectations. Later, as Natalie prepared for bed, she found herself wondering about Austin Jameson's past. What circumstances had led a clearly capable man to wander from ranch to ranch rather than establishing his own place? There was a guardedness about him that spoke of old wounds. She caught herself and frowned at her reflection in the vanity mirror. Austin was an employee, nothing more. His personal history was irrelevant so long as he performed his duties. The last thing the Rocking R needed was its owner developing inappropriate interest in the Foreman. Richard's photograph watched her from the bedside table. Natalie touched the silver frame gently. "I'm doing my best," she whispered. "I won't let them take what we built." Outside, the Montana night settled over the ranch, stars scattered like diamond dust across the vast sky. In his quarters behind the main house, Austin Jameson also prepared for sleep, reviewing mental notes about the operation and planning the days ahead. Neither could have imagined how their carefully maintained boundaries would soon begin to crumble, or how the coming months would challenge everything they believed about themselves and what they wanted from life on the frontier. Dawn broke clear and cool over the Rocking R, painting the distant mountains in shades of pink and gold. Austin was already awake, having risen before first light to assess the day's work ahead. The cattle drive preparations would need to begin in earnest, but first, he needed to understand exactly what he was working with. He'd spent yesterday observing, getting the measure of the ranch hands without interfering. Now it was time to establish his authority and set expectations. The men were gathered in the bunkhouse for breakfast when Austin entered. Conversation died immediately, all eyes turning to the new foreman. Austin recognized the wariness in their expressions. They'd been abandoned by Phillips, and loyalty wouldn't come automatically to his replacement. "Morning," Austin said simply. "I'll be straightforward with you men, Mrs. Randall hired me to get this cattle drive to Fort Benton on schedule. That's exactly what I intend to do." He looked around the room, meeting each man's gaze directly. "You don't know me, and I don't know you. But I respect skill and hard work, and I won't ask anything of you that I wouldn't do myself." Ben Hodges, the gray-haired cowboy Austin had spoken with briefly yesterday, gave a slight nod of acknowledgement. "Today I'll be riding the property with Mrs. Randall," Austin continued. Hodges, I'd like you to start separating the herd. Any cattle that look weak or sick need to be identified. Jackson and Peters, check our wagon and repair anything that needs attention. Riley, inventory our supplies and make a list of what we'll need. The rest of you, regular duties today. He delivered the orders calmly but firmly, establishing his role without unnecessary dominance displays. These were experienced men, they didn't need a tyrant, just clear direction. Any questions? Austin asked. A young cowboy at the back, barely 20, with a shock of red hair, raised his hand slightly. Sir, some of us were wondering. Is this drive really happening? There's talk in town that the Rocking R is struggling. Austin recognized the moment for what it was, a test of his confidence and information. The ranch is sound and the drive is absolutely happening, Mrs. Randall has a contract to fulfill and we're going to fulfill it. Any other concerns should be brought directly to me, not discussed as rumors. The message was clear, loyalty to the ranch and its owner was expected. The men seemed to accept this, returning to their breakfast with renewed purpose. Outside, Austin found Natalie already waiting, dressed in a practical riding outfit of dark green that complemented her slender figure while allowing freedom of movement. She sat a spirited bay mare with the ease of someone raised in the saddle. "Good morning, Mr. Jameson," she greeted him. "I trust you found everything satisfactory in your quarters." "Yes, ma'am." "Thank you." Austin mounted his dun gelding, noting with approval how well cared for the ranch's horses appeared to be. "Where shall we start?" "The north pastures, I think. They border Crawford's property, and you should understand that situation firsthand." They rode at a comfortable pace, the morning air still crisp as they left the ranch buildings behind. The landscape opened before them, rolling grasslands dotted with wildflowers, the distant mountains standing sentinel against the horizon. It was beautiful country, Austin acknowledged, the kind a man might dream of calling his own. "How many acres did you say?" he asked, surveying the expanse. 30,000, though not all contiguous. The main property is 20,000 acres. We have additional grazing rights on federal land to the south and water access agreements with the Blackfoot tribe for summer pasture. Austin was impressed by her detailed knowledge. Many ranch owners, particularly those who had inherited or married into their property, couldn't have provided such specific information. "Your husband established all this?" he asked as they crested a rise overlooking a verdant valley. Natalie's expression softened at the mention of Richard. "We built it together. Richard had the vision, but I handled much of the business, contracts, accounts, legal matters. My father insisted I receive an education that included such things, though he never intended me to use it this way." "Boston, you said?" She nodded. "My father owns shipping interests there. He expected me to marry an appropriate businessman and host dinner parties for the rest of my life." A rueful smile touched her lips. "Instead, I fell in love with a man who dreamed of Montana." The personal admission surprised Austin. Natalie Randall had maintained careful professionalism in their interactions thus far. But something about the open country seemed to invite confidences. "How did you meet?" he found himself asking. "Richard came to Boston seeking investors for a cattle operation. My father was impressed with his business proposal, if not his background." Her eyes remained fixed on the landscape ahead. "I was impressed with his passion, his vision of building something meaningful in this new territory." Austin could imagine the scandal, a Boston society daughter choosing a Western rancher over more suitable suitors. It would have required considerable courage. "We came here with nothing but Richard's knowledge and my dowry," Natalie continued. "The first 2 years were difficult. We lived in a 2-room cabin, worked from dawn until dusk, and weathered blizzards, drought, and every challenge the territory could throw at us." She turned to face Austin fully, her blue eyes intense. "This land isn't just property to me, Mr. Jameson. It represents everything we sacrificed and struggled for. I won't surrender it to men like Crawford who see only its value on paper." Austin understood then that Natalie's determination went beyond simple stubbornness or pride. The Rocking R was her legacy, the physical manifestation of a love and partnership cut short by tragedy. "I understand," he said simply. They continued riding, Natalie pointing out important features: the creek that never ran dry even in drought years, the sheltered draws where calves were born in spring, the line of cottonwoods that marked the property boundary with Crawford's ranch. As if summoned by the thought, 3 riders appeared in the distance, approaching from the neighboring property. Natalie's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Crawford," she murmured. "And it appears he's brought company." Austin assessed the approaching men with a practiced eye. The leader was a large man in his 40s, expensively dressed for ranch work, with a bearing that suggested he was accustomed to deference. Beside him rode a younger man with similar features, a son perhaps, and behind them, Austin recognized Jim Phillips, Natalie's former foreman. "Mrs. Randall," Crawford called as they drew near, his tone falsely jovial. "What a pleasant surprise! I was just showing my son Thomas the improvements we're making along our shared boundary." His gaze shifted to Austin, assessing and dismissive in the same glance. "I see you found new help, rather quickly I might add." "Mr. Crawford," Natalie's voice was coolly polite. "This is Austin Jameson, the Rocking R's new foreman, Mr. Jameson, Joseph Crawford of the Lazy Sea Ranch." Austin nodded acknowledgement but remained silent, watching the interplay. Phillips avoided eye contact entirely, his discomfort evident. "Jameson," Crawford tested the name. "Can't say I've heard of you. Where did Mrs. Randall find someone so promptly?" "Mr. Jameson's reputation preceded him," Natalie interjected before Austin could respond. "His experience with cattle drives is particularly impressive." Crawford's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Is that so? Well, I hope you've informed him that the trail through my property will require a toll this year. $5 per head seems fair, considering the wear on my land." Austin felt Natalie tense beside him but kept his expression neutral. The right-of-way was established. Crawford was simply trying to provoke a reaction or create financial pressure. "The existing agreements don't mention tolls," Natalie replied evenly, "as you well know." Crawford shrugged his broad shoulders. "Circumstances change, Mrs. Randall. The increased traffic is damaging my grazing land. Of course," he added with false concern, "if the fee presents difficulties, my offer to purchase the Rocking R remains open. In fact, I might even increase it, considering your urgent situation." Austin had encountered men like Crawford throughout the West, wealthy, entitled, and accustomed to getting their way through intimidation when other means failed. What interested him more was Philip's reaction. The former foreman was visibly uncomfortable with his new employer's tactics. "The Rocking R isn't for sale," Natalie stated firmly, "and will be exercising our legal right-of-way as established in the property agreements without unauthorized tolls." Crawford's expression hardened. "Be reasonable, Mrs. Randall. A young woman alone can't possibly manage." "Mrs. Randall isn't alone," Austin interrupted, his voice level but carrying an unmistakable note of warning. "And the Rocking R will be driving its cattle to Fort Benton on schedule, using the established trail." A tense silence followed. Crawford's son shifted impatiently in his saddle, but the older rancher studied Austin with new interest, recognizing that intimidation might not work as easily as he'd hoped. "I see," Crawford finally nodded. "Well, we'll address this matter through proper channels, then. Good day, Mrs. Randall." He turned his horse, then added over his shoulder, "Do give my regards to your father when you write. I understand he's quite concerned about your welfare out here." The 3 men rode away, leaving Natalie visibly shaken despite her composed exterior. Austin waited, allowing her a moment to collect herself before speaking. "He's been pressuring your family directly." Natalie's hands tightened on her reins. "Crawford has business connections in Boston. He's been suggesting to my father that I'm in over my head, that the ranch is failing. My father's last letter urged me to consider selling before the property loses more value." "Is it losing value?" She met his gaze directly. "No, the ranch is profitable and growing. Crawford is deliberately spreading misinformation because he wants our water rights and access to the Northern Valley." Austin believed her. Everything he'd seen suggested the Rocking R was well managed, with good stock and productive land. Crawford's tactics were about opportunity and power, not rescuing a failing operation. "He won't be the last to try coming through your property," Austin observed as they continued riding. "Once we stand firm on this drive, others will follow his lead if they think you're vulnerable." "I'm aware," Natalie's voice carried a weariness that made her seem suddenly younger, more vulnerable. Some days it feels as though I'm fighting the entire territory just to hold onto what's rightfully mine. Austin considered her position, a young widow battling entrenched attitudes about women's capabilities, neighboring ranchers eager to absorb her property, even family pressure from thousands of miles away. Lesser individuals would have surrendered by now. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I think you're doing admirably. This is a well-run operation. Your husband would be proud. Surprise flickered across her features, followed by a genuine smile that transformed her face, bringing warmth to eyes that had been guarded. Thank you, Mr. Jameson, that means a great deal. Something shifted between them in that moment, a respect that went beyond the professional relationship of owner and foreman. Austin felt it and immediately reinforced his mental boundaries. Natalie Randall was his employer, nothing more. Allowing any other feelings would only complicate an already difficult situation. They continued their tour of the property, the conversation returning to practical matters, grazing rotations, water access, fence maintenance. By the time they returned to the ranch buildings late in the afternoon, Austin had a comprehensive understanding of the operation and a growing respect for the woman who had built it. What he didn't realize was that a seed had been planted, the first crack in the wall he'd built around himself since his parents' death. A seed that would grow, despite his best efforts to remain detached, into something neither he nor Natalie had anticipated when she hired a stranger to save her cattle drive. The next 4 days passed in a blur of activity as the ranch prepared for the cattle drive. Austin worked from first light until well after dark, selecting the best drovers, preparing the chuck wagon, and inspecting every aspect of the operation. The men responded well to his leadership style, firm but fair, with a willingness to work alongside them rather than merely giving orders. By the evening before departure, everything was ready. 200 healthy cattle had been separated from the main herd, the wagon was loaded with provisions, and 6 experienced drovers were prepared to ride out at dawn. Austin reviewed the final details with Natalie in her study, the lamplight casting warm shadows across the room. The route is established, he explained, tracing the trail on the map spread between them. We'll cross Crawford's land here, following the creek bed to minimize impact on his grazing areas. That removes any legitimate complaint about damage. Natalie leaned closer to examine the map, her honey-blonde hair catching the lamplight. And if he tries to stop you anyway? He won't risk open confrontation, it would expose him legally. Austin straightened, rolling the map carefully, but he might try to delay us, create minor obstacles. Nothing we can't handle. Natalie nodded, her expression thoughtful. I have complete confidence in your abilities, Mr. Jameson. She hesitated, then added, I plan to ride with you tomorrow, at least as far as the boundary. Austin looked up sharply. Is that wise? Crawford might interpret your presence as a provocation. This is my ranch and my cattle drive, she replied firmly. I won't hide in the house while others carry out my business. He recognized the determination in her voice and knew further objection would be futile. In truth, he admired her resolve, even as he worried about the complications her presence might create. As you wish, Mrs. Randall, we leave at first light. She rose, signaling the end of their meeting. I've asked Mrs. Cooper to prepare a special dinner tonight for you and the drovers, a good meal before the trail. Austin was touched by the thoughtful gesture. The men will appreciate that. Their eyes met briefly, and Austin was struck again by the quiet strength in her gaze. Natalie Randall defied every expectation he'd formed from her initial appearance. Beneath the refined exterior was a woman of remarkable resilience and courage. Thank you, she said softly, for everything you've done this week. The ranch hands respect you already. I can see it in how they respond to your leadership. The genuine appreciation in her voice made Austin uncomfortable, not because it was unwelcome, but because it stirred emotions he'd long suppressed. Attachment was dangerous, he'd learned that lesson too well to forget it now. Just doing my job, ma'am, he replied, retreating to professional distance. If Natalie noticed his withdrawal, she gave no sign. Until tomorrow, then. That night, Austin lay awake in his quarters, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch settling into darkness. Tomorrow would be challenging, not just because of Crawford's potential interference, but because of his own conflicted feelings. He'd come to the rocking hour expecting a straightforward employment arrangement. Instead, he found himself increasingly drawn to its determined owner, admiring qualities he hadn't expected to find. It was dangerous territory for a man who'd survived by avoiding entanglements. Sleep came reluctantly, bringing dreams of paths not taken and connections long denied. Morning arrived with the promise of fair weather, clear skies and mild temperatures ideal for starting a cattle drive. The ranch bustled with pre-dawn activity, drovers checking saddles and gathering gear, the chuck wagon receiving its final supplies. Austin supervised it all with quiet efficiency, his focus absolute despite the minimal sleep. When Natalie appeared, dressed in practical riding clothes with her hair braided and pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat, he acknowledged her with a nod. "Everything's ready, Mrs. Randall. Ben Hodges will lead the herd with Riley and Jackson on the flanks. Peters and Thompson will ride drag and Miller handles the chuck wagon. I'll scout ahead to ensure clear passage." Natalie mounted her bay mare, adjusting her gloves. "And I'll ride with you to the boundary." The drive began smoothly, cattle moving out of the holding pen and onto the trail with minimal fuss. Austin rode ahead as planned, occasionally glancing back to ensure the herd was maintaining pace. Natalie kept her horse alongside his, her posture betraying no hint of the anxiety she must feel about this crucial operation. They had been riding for perhaps 2 hours, the boundary with Crawford's property just visible in the distance, when Austin spotted riders approaching, at least 8 men, moving with deliberate speed. "Crawford," Natalie murmured, shading her eyes against the morning sun, "and more men than necessary for a casual encounter." Austin assessed the situation quickly. The approaching group was positioned to intercept them before they could reach the boundary. Their numbers suggested intimidation rather than violence, but on the frontier, such situations could escalate unpredictably. "Stay with the herd," he instructed Natalie. "I'll speak with them." To his lack of surprise, she guided her horse forward instead. "This is my drive, Mr. Jameson. I'll handle Crawford." Before he could argue, she had urged her mare ahead, forcing Austin to follow or allow her to face the confrontation alone. He swore under his breath, impressed by her courage but concerned about her safety. Crawford and his men halted their horses in a loose formation that effectively blocked the trail. Among them, Austin spotted Phillips and young Thomas Crawford, along with several rough-looking hired hands. "Mrs. Randall," Crawford called, his voice carrying across the open ground, "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. The trail through my property is closed for repairs." Austin pulled his gelding alongside Natalie's mare, deliberately positioning himself slightly forward of her. "There's no misunderstanding, Crawford. The right-of-way is legally established." Crawford's attention shifted to Austin, his expression hardening. "This doesn't concern you, Jameson. It's a matter between neighbors." "Mr. Jameson speaks for the Rocking R," Natalie replied coolly, "and he's correct. Your attempt to block our passage is legally indefensible." Crawford's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Legal matters can take months to resolve, Mrs. Randall. Meanwhile, your cattle need to reach Fort Benton. Perhaps we should discuss an accommodation that benefits us both." Austin recognized the tactic, create an artificial crisis, then offer a self-serving solution. "The only accommodation needed is for your men to clear the trail." One of Crawford's hired hands, a scar-faced man with cold eyes, moved his horse forward slightly. "You're outnumbered, Cowboy. Might want to watch your tone." Austin held the man's gaze steadily, unintimidated. He'd faced worse odds and more dangerous men during his years on the frontier. Numbers won't matter if this becomes a legal issue. Interference with a contractual cattle drive carries significant penalties. Uncertainty flickered across Crawford's features. Austin had correctly identified his approach: intimidation rather than open confrontation, pressure rather than violence. The rancher hadn't expected informed resistance. "Perhaps," Natalie interjected diplomatically, "we could discuss this matter after our drive is complete. The Rocking R would be open to reviewing trail usage for future seasons, provided our current obligations are met." It was a masterful response, offering a future negotiation without yielding on the immediate issue. Crawford understood he was being outmaneuvered but couldn't withdraw without losing face. "1 week," he finally said. "You have 1 week to move your cattle through my property. After that, the trail closes for maintenance, regardless of your legal claims." Austin knew the drive would take no more than 5 days to clear Crawford's land. The rancher was creating the appearance of concession while actually giving up nothing. Agreed, Natalie replied with equal pragmatism. We appreciate your cooperation, Mr. Crawford. Crawford signaled his men to move aside, though his expression remained thunderous. As Austin and Natalie rode past, he called after them, "This territory respects strength, Mrs. Randall. Remember that when you're considering your options." Once they were safely beyond earshot, Natalie released a shaky breath. That was unpleasant. Austin studied her with newfound respect. You handled him perfectly, firm on the essentials, flexible on appearances. Crawford couldn't find a way to escalate without looking unreasonable. A faint smile touched her lips. My father negotiated with difficult shipping partners for 40 years. I learned by watching. They had reached the property boundary, marked by a line of weathered fence posts. Beyond stretched Crawford's land, 5,000 acres that stood between the rocking R and the trail to Fort Benton. Natalie reined her horse to a halt. This is where I turn back. Austin nodded, suddenly aware that he would miss her steady presence during the drive. The thought surprised him. He had always preferred working alone, relying only on himself. Yet something about Natalie Randall had begun to shift that long-held belief. We'll deliver the cattle on schedule, he assured her. And return within 2 weeks, weather permitting. She extended her hand, a gesture both formal and unexpectedly intimate. Be careful, Mr. Jameson. Crawford may have yielded today, but he's not a man who accepts defeat easily. Austin took her hand, noting its strength despite its delicacy. I've dealt with his kind before. The drive will succeed. For a moment, something unspoken passed between them, concern that went beyond professional responsibility, trust that transcended their brief acquaintance. Then Natalie withdrew her hand and turned her horse toward home. Austin watched her ride away, a solitary figure against the vast Montana landscape, before rejoining the approaching herd. The cattle drive had begun, and with it, a journey that would test more than his skills as a foreman. It would challenge everything he believed about attachment, vulnerability, and his place in the frontier world. The cattle drive proceeded smoothly for the first 3 days, the herd moving at a steady pace across Crawford's land without incident. Austin maintained vigilant watch, expecting some form of harassment despite the agreement, but Crawford's men kept their distance, observing from ridgelines but never approaching. On the 4th day, as they neared the northern boundary of Crawford's property, the first real challenge emerged. The creek that paralleled their trail had been dammed overnight, creating a muddy obstacle where the cattle needed to cross. It was a deliberate act designed to delay the drive without constituting open interference. Crawford's work, Ben Hodges asked as he and Austin surveyed the obstruction. Austin nodded grimly. "Men to slow us down, force us to exhaust our week's passage time." "What's the play, boss?" Austin considered their options. Detouring around the mud would cost precious hours and risk scattering the herd. Attempting to drive the cattle through might result in bogged animals and further delays. We clear it, he decided. Get Peters and Jackson. We'll dismantle that dam while the herd rests. The work was grueling. Mud-soaked logs had been secured with rope and stones, requiring considerable effort to disassemble. Austin worked alongside his men, ignoring the discomfort of wet clothes and the knowledge that Crawford's observers were likely enjoying the spectacle from a distance. By mid-afternoon, the passage was clear enough for the herd to continue. Tired but satisfied, Austin gave the order to move out, determined to clear Crawford's land before nightfall and remove any pretense for further interference. As dusk approached, they crossed the boundary into public grazing land where Crawford's influence couldn't reach. Austin called a halt, establishing camp near a small stream that provided clean water for the cattle and the men. After a simple but filling dinner prepared by Miller, the drovers settled around the campfire, the atmosphere noticeably lighter now that Crawford's property lay behind them. Austin accepted a cup of coffee and found a seat slightly apart from the others, his thoughts turning to the rocking R and its determined owner. Natalie would be pleased they'd overcome Crawford's obstruction without significant delay. He could imagine her satisfied expression when he reported their progress, the quiet confidence in her blue eyes when plans succeeded. The thought brought an unexpected warmth that had nothing to do with the campfire. You handled that damn situation well, Hodges remarked, breaking into Austin's thoughts as he settled nearby. Crawford's men would have enjoyed watching us struggle with bogged cattle. Austin nodded. Crawford wants the drive to fail, proving Natalie Mrs. Randall can't manage without selling. Hodges studied him over his coffee cup. She's something, isn't she? Most Eastern women would have sold after Richard died. Too hard out here for them.
Mrs.
Randall isn't most women, Austin replied, more sharply than he intended. The older man's eyes crinkled with knowing amusement. No, she surely isn't. After a contemplative silence, he added, known her since she first came to the territory with Richard. 19 years old, fresh from Boston society, and determined to build something out here despite knowing nothing about ranching. Austin found himself curious despite his usual disinterest in others' histories. She mentioned they started with almost nothing. Hodges chuckled. That two-room cabin was barely weather-tight. First winter nearly broke them, blizzards, wolves taking calves, supplies running low. But that woman never complained, never suggested returning east. Learned to ride, to mend fences, to help with calving. Richard was lucky to find her. The image of Natalie Randall, refined, educated, clearly born to privilege, choosing such a difficult path rather than the comfortable life awaiting her in Boston, impressed Austin anew. It reflected a courage and determination he'd rarely encountered. She's fighting for more than just property, Hodges continued thoughtfully. It's what they built together, their dream. Selling would mean surrendering that, admitting Richard's vision died with him. Austin understood such loyalty. Wasn't that why he'd maintained his solitary existence after his parents' deaths? Continuing the independent life they'd valued, refusing to surrender to easier paths that would have meant abandoning their principles. Crawford underestimates her, he observed. Hodges nodded. Most men do. It's their mistake, he rose, stretching tired muscles. Get some rest, boss, still have 3 days' ride to Fort Benton. Left alone with his thoughts, Austin stared into the dying embers of the fire. The cattle drive was proceeding well, his primary responsibility progressing as planned. Yet his thoughts continually returned to the rocking R, to the woman who had hired him expecting nothing more than professional competence and finding herself with an unexpected ally. For the first time in years, Austin felt the stirring of something beyond duty or obligation, a connection to someone else's struggle, a desire to see Natalie Randall succeed that went beyond fulfilling the terms of his employment. It was unfamiliar territory, as challenging in its way as the physical landscape they traversed. The remainder of the journey to Fort Benton passed without significant incident. The cattle arrived in good condition, and Austin negotiated a fair price with the Army representatives who had contracted for the herd. The payment in bank drafts and some cash for immediate expenses represented a substantial sum, exactly as Natalie had predicted. As they prepared for the return journey, Austin found himself increasingly eager to reach the rocking R. He told himself it was simply professional pride in a job well done, the natural desire to report success to his employer. But in quiet moments, he acknowledged a deeper truth. He wanted to see Natalie's face when he delivered the news, to share in her victory against those who had doubted her. The return journey seemed longer despite their unburdened state. When the familiar outline of the rocking R's main house finally appeared on the horizon, Austin felt an unexpected surge of emotion. In just a few short weeks, this place had begun to feel like more than just another temporary employment. Natalie was waiting on the porch as they rode into the yard, her expression composed but her eyes betraying her anxiety. Austin dismounted and approached, removing his hat. The drive was successful, Mrs. Randall, he reported formally, aware of the watching ranch hands. 200 head delivered to Fort Benton at the contracted price. Relief washed over her features, followed by quiet pride. Thank you, Mr. Jameson. And thank you, men, for your excellent work. Austin handed her an envelope containing the bank drafts and payment receipts. Their fingers brushed momentarily, sending an unexpected current through his hand. Natalie's eyes widened slightly, suggesting she had felt it too. There were some complications, he continued, recovering his professional demeanor. Crawford attempted to delay us with a constructed obstacle, but we overcame it without significant loss of time. Natalie's jaw tightened at Crawford's name, but her voice remained steady. I'm not surprised he tried something. I am impressed you managed it so efficiently. She turned to address the returning drovers. There will be a special dinner tonight to celebrate your successful return. Until then, rest and enjoy a well-deserved break from duties. The men dispersed, their weariness evident but their spirits high after the successful drive. Austin lingered, finding himself reluctant to end the conversation with Natalie. "Would you join me in my study to discuss the details?" she asked, as though sensing his hesitation. "I'd like a full report while it's fresh in your mind." In the privacy of the study, Natalie's professional facade softened. "I was worried," she admitted, settling into the chair behind her desk. "Crawford visited twice while you were gone, each time with a new, generous offer to buy the ranch. When I refused, he suggested I might find myself unable to fulfill future contracts without his cooperation." Austin leaned against the window frame, studying her. Despite the confident exterior, he could see the strain of the past 2 weeks in the faint shadows beneath her eyes, the tension in her shoulders. "He's bluffing," Austin assured her. "We proved we can move cattle through his property despite his interference. The next drive will be easier now that he knows we won't be intimidated." Natalie's smile held genuine warmth. "We did prove that, didn't we?"
Thanks to you.
"Thanks to your preparation and planning," Austin corrected. "The drive succeeded because you had everything organized before I arrived."
I just executed your strategy.
Their eyes met, mutual respect and something deeper passing between them. Austin felt that dangerous pull again, the desire for connection he'd denied himself for so long. "I'm glad you were here," Natalie said softly. "Not just for the drive, but—" She hesitated, seemingly struggling to find appropriate words. "It's been lonely, making these decisions alone, fighting these battles without someone to share the burden." The vulnerability in her admission touched something deep within Austin. He recognized the isolation she described, had lived with it himself since his parents' deaths. But where he had chosen solitude as protection, Natalie had it thrust upon her by circumstance. "You're doing remarkably well," he said quietly. "Your husband would be proud of how you've maintained what you built together." Tears briefly shimmered in her eyes before she blinked them away. "I hope so. Sometimes I wonder if I'm being foolish, if everyone else is right and I should simply sell and return east." "Is that what you want?" Austin asked, genuinely curious. Natalie shook her head without hesitation. "No, this is my home now. I love this land, this life we created. Even with its challenges and dangers, it's where I belong." Austin understood completely. The frontier's harsh beauty, its demands and freedoms, became part of a person. Those who adapted to its rhythms couldn't easily return to more civilized constraints. "Then you're not being foolish," he stated firmly. "You're fighting for what matters to you. There's no shame in that." Gratitude softened her expression.
Thank you, Mr. Jameson, for understanding.
The intimate moment stretched between them, neither willing to break it. Finally, Natalie straightened, returning to practicalities. "We should discuss the next steps for the ranch. With the cattle drive completed successfully, we can focus on the horse breeding program and preparing for winter." Austin nodded, accepting the return to professional matters even as part of him wanted to continue exploring the connection that had briefly emerged. "I've been thinking about improvements to the north pasture fencing. With Crawford so interested in that boundary, we should strengthen our position there." They spent the next hour discussing ranch operations, falling into an easy collaboration that felt remarkably natural. Austin found himself offering suggestions beyond his immediate responsibilities, and Natalie welcomed his input without defensiveness. By the time they concluded their meeting, something had subtly shifted in their relationship. No longer simply employer and employee, they had become partners in a shared enterprise, united by common purpose against external threats. What neither acknowledged was the personal dimension developing beneath that professional alliance, feelings that would soon complicate their carefully maintained boundaries and force them to confront the wounds and fears that had shaped their individual journeys to this moment. The weeks following the successful cattle drive brought a new rhythm to the rocking R. With Austin firmly established as foreman, the ranch operations ran smoothly, the hands responding to his quiet authority with increasing respect. Natalie found herself with more time for the business aspects of the ranch, reviewing contracts, planning improvements, considering expansion opportunities previously set aside during the crisis of the drive. More unexpectedly, she found herself looking forward to her daily meetings with Austin. What had begun as necessary consultations evolved into wide-ranging discussions about the ranch's future, conversations that often continued through dinner and into the evening. Austin's insights proved valuable not just regarding cattle and horses, but in navigating the complex social dynamics of the territory. As summer progressed toward fall, Natalie became increasingly aware of a shift in their relationship. Austin remained unfailingly professional, maintaining appropriate boundaries between employer and employee. Yet something warmer had developed beneath that formal exterior, a friendship perhaps, or possibly something deeper that neither was prepared to acknowledge. On a crisp September evening, they sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. A comfortable silence had settled between them, the kind possible only between people who had moved beyond the need for constant conversation. "Winter comes early here," Austin observed, his gaze on the darkening horizon. "We should consider additional hay storage if the weather predictions hold true." Natalie nodded, appreciating his foresight. "I'll speak with Prescott about increasing our order. Better to be overprepared than caught short if the snow arrives early." Another silence fell, but this one held a different quality, expectant, as though words hovered unspoken between them. "The ranch has changed since you arrived," Natalie finally said, her voice soft in the gathering dusk. "Not just the operations, but the feeling of the place. It seems more secure." Austin glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "The men needed consistent leadership. They have that now." "It's more than that," Natalie insisted gently. "Your presence has made a difference beyond the practical improvements. I've felt it myself." He shifted slightly, uncomfortable with the personal direction of the conversation, yet not withdrawing entirely. "I'm glad to have been of service." Natalie studied his profile in the fading light, noting the tension that appeared whenever their discussions ventured beyond ranch business. Austin Jameson was a contradiction, capable of remarkable perception regarding others, yet seemingly determined to maintain emotional distance. "You rarely speak of your past," she observed carefully, "where you were before coming here." Austin's expression closed slightly. "Not much to tell, various ranches, cattle drives. The usual life of a hired hand." "But it wasn't always that way, was it?" Natalie pressed gently. "You mentioned your parents had a homestead, you weren't born to drifting." A muscle tightened in his jaw. "No. But circumstances change." Natalie recognized the resistance in his tone but found herself unwilling to retreat. Over the past weeks, Austin had become important to her in ways that transcended his role as foreman. Understanding him, the experiences that had shaped him, suddenly seemed essential. "What happened," she asked softly, "to your parents' place?" Austin remained silent so long that Natalie thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a controlled neutrality that barely masked deeper emotions. "They died in the winter of '60. Influenza swept through the settlement. By the time the doctor arrived from the nearest town, it was too late." Natalie's heart ached at the stark simplicity of his account. "You were 16, she recalled from their earlier conversations. He nodded once. "The homestead had debts. Medical bills, supplies borrowed during the bad season. When I couldn't meet the payments, the bank foreclosed." "You lost everything," Natalie murmured, understanding blooming. This explained so much about Austin's self-contained nature, his reluctance to form attachments. "I learned that nothing is permanent on the frontier," he said, his gaze fixed on the darkening landscape. "Everything you build can be taken by nature, by illness, by circumstance. The only way to survive is to need nothing and no one." The philosophy explained his drifting existence, his professional competence coupled with personal detachment. Austin had constructed a life designed to minimize vulnerability, to prevent the devastating losses he'd experienced as a young man. "That's a lonely way to live," Natalie observed gently. A faint, humorless smile touched his lips. "Lonely is safer than loss." Natalie understood his perspective all too well. After Richard's death, she had retreated into grief and responsibility, focusing on the ranch to avoid confronting the emptiness of her personal life. If not for the immediate threats to her property, she might have continued that existence indefinitely. I thought the same after Richard died, she admitted, that if I kept everyone at a distance, I couldn't be hurt again. The ranch became everything, not just our dream, but my shield against feeling. Austin turned to her, surprise evident in his expression. Natalie rarely spoke so openly about her grief. What changed? He asked quietly. Natalie considered the question thoughtfully. I realized that living in fear of loss meant not really living at all. Richard wouldn't have wanted that for me. He believed in building something meaningful, even knowing how fragile life can be. Her gaze met Austin's directly. Isn't that the true courage of the frontier, not just surviving its hardships, but daring to create something beautiful despite them? The question hung between them, challenging not just Austin's philosophy, but the walls he'd built around himself. For a moment, Natalie thought she glimpsed something vulnerable in his eyes, a longing for connection at war with the protective instincts of years. Before he could respond, the sound of approaching horses broke the moment. Austin rose immediately, his hand moving instinctively to the revolver at his hip as he scanned the darkness. "Were we expecting visitors?" he asked, his voice returning to its professional timbre. Natalie stood as well, straining to see through the gathering dusk. "No. Everyone in the territory knows we don't receive after sundown." Three riders emerged from the shadows, moving at a deliberate pace that suggested purpose rather than casual visitation. As they drew closer, Natalie recognized Joseph Crawford's substantial figure in the lead. "Stay behind me," Austin instructed quietly, moving to position himself between Natalie and the approaching men. Crawford reined his horse to a halt at the edge of the yard, his companions, including the scar-faced man who had been present during the confrontation before the cattle drive, remaining slightly behind him. "Mrs. Randall," Crawford called, his tone falsely cordial. "Apologies for the late hour, but I've just received news that couldn't wait until morning." Natalie stepped forward, deliberately moving alongside Austin rather than remaining behind him. "What news would be so urgent, Mr. Crawford?" Crawford dismounted with surprising agility for a man of his size, approaching the porch with measured steps. "Word from Boston, actually, concerning your father." Alarm flickered through Natalie. Her father's last letter had mentioned nothing amiss with his health. What about my father? A smile spread across Crawford's face that made Natalie instantly wary. "It seems Randall Shipping is facing financial difficulties. Quite serious ones, according to my sources. Something about investments in a railroad venture gone sour." Natalie maintained her composed expression despite her racing thoughts. Her father's company had always been stable, prosperous even. If there were significant problems, why hadn't he mentioned them? "I fail to see why my family's business concerns would bring you to my door after dark," she replied evenly. Crawford's smile widened. "Because I'm in a position to help, my dear. I have banking connections in Boston who could assist your father, refinance his debts, provide operating capital. All that would be required is a favorable word from me." Understanding dawned with cold clarity, in exchange for the rocking R. "A mutually beneficial arrangement," Crawford confirmed smoothly. "Your father maintains his business and reputation. You're freed from the burdens of managing this operation alone, and I gain property that should naturally be part of the Lazy Sea." Austin had remained silent during this exchange, but Natalie felt his tension, the coiled readiness of someone anticipating conflict. "If my father needed assistance, he would inform me directly," Natalie stated firmly, "not through intermediaries with transparent motives." Crawford's expression hardened. Perhaps he's too proud to admit his difficulties. Or perhaps he hasn't fully realized the severity of his situation. "My information comes from reliable sources within Boston financial circles." Doubt crept into Natalie's thoughts despite her determination. Her father was proud, and he had opposed her decision to remain in Montana after Richard's death. If he were truly facing financial ruin, might he conceal it rather than give her reason to reconsider her choice? "I appreciate your concern," she replied carefully, "but I'll need to verify this information with my father directly before considering any proposals." Crawford shrugged with exaggerated nonchalance. "Of course. But financial disasters move quickly, Mrs. Randall. By the time letters travel to Boston and back, opportunities for intervention may have passed. He reached into his coat pocket, withdrawing an envelope. I've taken the liberty of drafting terms that would satisfy all parties. Review them at your convenience. He extended the envelope, forcing Natalie to either accept it or appear deliberately hostile. She took it with reluctance, maintaining her dignified demeanor. I'll consider your information, Mr. Crawford. Good evening. It was a clear dismissal, but Crawford lingered, his gaze shifting to Austin. Jameson. I hear the cattle drive went well despite our little
misunderstanding.
No misunderstanding, Austin replied coolly, just a dam that happened to appear overnight. Crawford's laugh held no humor. The spring runoff can do strange things to a creek bed. You handled it admirably, I'm told. His eyes narrowed slightly. A man with your skills could find better opportunities than this struggling operation. The lazy sea is always looking for experienced hands at considerably higher wages. The blatant attempt to poach her foreman left Natalie momentarily speechless. Austin, however, remained unperturbed. I'm satisfied with my current position, he stated firmly. Crawford studied him with calculating eyes. Loyalty is admirable if occasionally misplaced. Should your circumstances change, my offer remains open. With a slight nod to Natalie, he returned to his horse, mounting with the same surprising grace. Think carefully about my proposal, Mrs. Randall. Some opportunities don't present themselves twice. The three riders departed, leaving Natalie and Austin standing in silence as darkness fully claimed the ranch. Once they were beyond earshot, Natalie released a shaky breath. The audacity, she murmured, her fingers tightening on the envelope she held. To come here with unverified claims about my father's business, then attempt to hire away my foreman in the same conversation. Austin's expression was grave. He's escalating his pressure. The successful cattle drive proved you can manage without selling, so he's looking for new vulnerabilities. Natalie nodded, moving back to the porch and sinking onto the bench. The question is whether there's any truth to his claims about my father's financial situation. Austin joined her, his proximity offering unexpected comfort. When did you last hear from Boston?
3 weeks ago.
Father mentioned nothing about financial difficulties, though he did renew his suggestion that I consider selling and returning east. Natalie frowned, considering the implications. If Crawford has business connections in Boston, he might have learned of problems before they became widely known. Or he might be manufacturing concerns to manipulate you, Austin pointed out. Either way, the fastest approach is to telegraph your father directly. I can ride to Fort Benton tomorrow and send a message. Natalie looked up at him, gratitude warming her despite the evening's troubling developments. Would you? It would take weeks for letters to reach Boston and return. Of course, his steady gaze conveyed reassurance. Whatever Crawford's game, we'll address it with facts, not speculation. The word "we" registered with particular significance. Austin had automatically aligned himself with her position, considering Crawford's threat as something to be faced together rather than her problem alone. The realization brought an unexpected surge of emotion. Thank you, she said softly.
For everything.
He nodded, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Their earlier conversation, the personal revelations and philosophical differences, hadn't been forgotten, merely set aside in the face of immediate concerns. As Austin excused himself to check the property before retiring, Natalie remained on the porch, Crawford's envelope unopened in her hands. The night had brought unwelcome complications, yet she found herself strangely strengthened rather than discouraged. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she no longer faced them completely alone. Whether Austin realized it or not, the walls he'd built against attachment were beginning to crumble, and with them, the isolation that had defined both their lives for too long. Austin rode out at dawn the following morning, pushing his gelding at a steady pace toward Fort Benton. The telegram to Natalie's father was composed carefully in his mind, direct questions about the financial status of Randall Shipping, with no mention of Crawford's claims that might cause unnecessary alarm if they proved false. The 2-day journey gave Austin unwelcome time for reflection. The previous evening's conversation with Natalie had ventured into territory he typically avoided: personal history, emotional truths, philosophical perspectives on loss and connection. Her insights had struck uncomfortably close to home, challenging beliefs he'd held since his parents' deaths. Living in fear of loss meant not really living at all. Her words echoed in his thoughts as miles passed beneath his horse's hooves. Was that what he'd been doing all these years, not just surviving the frontier's hardships but deliberately avoiding its possibilities? The idea disturbed him, suggesting that his carefully constructed independence might be less a strength than a limitation. More troubling still were his growing feelings for Natalie herself. What had begun as professional respect had evolved into something deeper: admiration for her courage, appreciation of her intelligence, and increasingly, awareness of her as a woman rather than merely an employer. The attraction was unprofessional, inappropriate, and almost certainly unreciprocated. Natalie was his employer, a wealthy ranch owner still honoring her late husband's memory. Austin was a hired hand with nothing to offer but his labor. Yet he couldn't deny the connection that had formed between them, particularly during their evening conversations. There were moments when her guard lowered, when something warm and inviting appeared in her blue eyes, suggesting possibilities beyond their current relationship. Such thoughts were dangerous. Even if Natalie shared some measure of interest, which Austin doubted, acting on such feelings would only complicate an already difficult situation. Crawford and his allies were watching for any vulnerability, any excuse to question Natalie's management of the Rocking R. A personal entanglement with her foreman would provide exactly the ammunition they sought. No, Austin concluded as Fort Benton appeared on the horizon. The only sensible course was to maintain professional boundaries, to serve the ranch's interests without allowing personal feelings to interfere. Perhaps when the current threats had passed and the Rocking R was secure, he would move on as he always had, seeking new employment where emotional complications couldn't follow. The thought brought an unexpected hollowness, a sense of loss for something not yet possessed. Austin pushed it aside, focusing instead on the practical task ahead. Fort Benton's telegraph office was busy when he arrived, merchants and traders sending commercial messages east and west. Austin drafted his telegram carefully, addressing it to William Randall in Boston with specific questions about the company's financial status and instructions for the reply to be sent to the Rocking R. With that task completed, he considered staying the night in town, but an inexplicable urgency drove him to begin the return journey immediately. Crawford's unexpected visit had left him uneasy, concerned about leaving Natalie alone despite the capable ranch hands who remained at the property. He made camp as darkness fell, building a small fire more for company than warmth in the mild autumn evening. As he drank his coffee and watched the stars emerge above, Austin found his thoughts returning to Natalie. Was she sitting on the porch now, perhaps looking at these same stars? Had Crawford returned with further pressure or false information? The protective instinct he felt toward her went beyond professional duty. Austin recognized it as something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: a personal investment in another's welfare, a connection that transcended practical considerations. It was dangerous territory for a man who had survived by remaining detached. Morning found Austin on the trail early, pushing his horse at a pace that would return him to the Rocking R by afternoon. As he crested the final rise overlooking the ranch, relief washed through him at the sight of the buildings intact, smoke rising peacefully from the main house chimney. He was halfway down the slope when movement caught his attention, riders approaching the ranch from the direction of Crawford's property. Austin urged his gelding forward, instinct telling him to reach the house before the visitors arrived. Natalie was in the yard when he rode in, directing two ranch hands who were unloading supplies from a wagon. She looked up at Austin's approach, relief visible in her expression. "You're back sooner than expected," she greeted him, moving to take his horse's reins as he dismounted. "Sent the telegram yesterday," Austin replied, his attention divided between Natalie and the approaching riders. "We should have a reply within a day or two." Natalie followed his gaze, her posture stiffening slightly. "That's Thomas Crawford and some of his father's men. They've been watching the property since yesterday, not approaching, just observing from the ridge." Austin's unease deepened. The surveillance suggested Crawford was planning something beyond his usual pressure tactics. Any trouble while I was gone? He asked quietly. Natalie shook her head. Nothing direct, though, Mr. Prescott mentioned when I was in town that Crawford has been spreading rumors about the ranch's financial instability, suggesting I'll be forced to sell before winter. The systematic campaign to undermine confidence in the Rocking R's viability was exactly what Austin would expect from a man like Crawford, creating a narrative that would make Natalie's eventual capitulation seem inevitable rather than coerced. "Did you read his proposal?" Austin asked as young Crawford and three hands rode into the yard. Yes, the terms were insulting, barely half the ranch's value, with conditions that would essentially surrender control immediately while payments stretched over years. Natalie's expression hardened. "I burned it." Austin suppressed a smile at her defiance. Natalie Randall might have been raised in Boston society, but she'd developed a frontier woman's steel during her years in Montana. Thomas Crawford dismounted with the casual arrogance of a young man accustomed to deference. Unlike his father's calculated charm, Thomas made little effort to disguise his contempt. "Mrs. Randall," he greeted her with minimal courtesy. "My father sent me to inquire about your decision regarding his proposal." Natalie maintained her dignity despite the young man's rudeness. "Please inform your father that I'm awaiting information from Boston before considering any offers for the property." Thomas's expression suggested he found her response amusing. "Father said you might say that. He asked me to remind you that time is of the essence in these matters." "Is that all?" Natalie asked coolly. The younger Crawford surveyed the ranch yard with exaggerated assessment. "Father also suggested I mention that winter preparation seems behind schedule here. Hay storage looks inadequate, and your north pasture fence line needs significant repair before the first snow." The observation was accurate but delivered with deliberate condescension. Austin stepped forward slightly, his voice level but carrying an unmistakable warning. "The Rocking R's preparations are proceeding on schedule. Your concern is unnecessary." Thomas's attention shifted to Austin, his expression hardening. "Jameson, still playing Foreman instead of finding real work, I see." "This is real work," Austin replied evenly, "and you're interfering with it. State your business and move on." A flush crept up Thomas's neck at the dismissal. "My father owns the largest ranch in the territory. He'll own this one too, sooner or later. You'd be wise to remember that." Natalie intervened before Austin could respond. "Please tell your father that I'll communicate my decision directly once I've received the information I need. Good day, Mr. Crawford." The dismissal was unmistakable. Thomas hesitated, clearly wanting to assert himself further but lacking his father's strategic patience. Finally, he remounted his horse with a scowl. "Father says to tell you he's a patient man, Mrs. Randall, but patience has limits." With that parting remark, he signaled his men to follow and rode from the yard, dust rising from his horse's hooves in a deliberately showy departure. Once they were gone, Natalie released a slow breath. Crawford's becoming more aggressive. That visit wasn't just about the proposal, it was to assess our preparations, looking for weaknesses. Austin nodded grimly. "And he found what he was looking for. The north fence line is vulnerable, and our hay storage is behind schedule." "We've been focused on the cattle drive and horse training," Natalie acknowledged. "Winter preparations have fallen behind." "We can catch up," Austin assured her. "I'll reassign men to the fence repairs tomorrow, and we'll accelerate the hay deliveries from town." Natalie studied him with a thoughtful expression. "You don't have to take on Crawford's challenges as your own, you know. This isn't your fight." The statement surprised Austin. "I'm the foreman. The ranch's security is my responsibility." "Your responsibility is managing the hands and operations," Natalie corrected gently. "Crawford's campaign against me goes beyond that. I wouldn't blame you for reconsidering your position, especially given his offer of employment at higher wages." Austin felt a flash of something approaching anger. "Is that what you think of me? That I'd jump to Crawford's payroll for better pay?" "No," Natalie replied softly, "but I wouldn't hold you to this job if you felt it was becoming too complicated." The word hung between them, carrying meanings beyond the immediate situation with Crawford. Austin realized she was offering him an exit, a way to withdraw from the growing personal connection between them as much as from the ranch's troubles. "I gave my word when I took this position," he said firmly. "I don't break it for convenience or comfort." Relief flickered across Natalie's features before her composure returned. "Thank you, your loyalty means a great deal to me, to the ranch," she amended quickly. The slip revealed more than she perhaps intended, suggesting that Austin's presence had become important to her personally, not just professionally. The realization brought both satisfaction and concern. If Natalie was developing feelings beyond their working relationship, the situation was even more complicated than he'd feared. "We should discuss the winter preparations," he suggested, deliberately returning to practical matters. Crawford was right about one thing: we're behind schedule on critical tasks. Natalie nodded, accepting the change of subject with visible relief. They walked together toward the main house, falling into the familiar pattern of ranch management discussions while carefully avoiding the personal undercurrents that had briefly surfaced. Neither mentioned their interrupted conversation from the previous evening, the philosophical exchange about attachment and vulnerability that had revealed more of Austin's past than he'd shared with anyone in years. That terrain seemed too dangerous now, with Crawford's pressure escalating and their own relationship growing increasingly complex. Yet as they reviewed supply lists and repair priorities, Austin found himself acutely aware of Natalie's presence, the grace of her movements, the intelligence in her blue eyes, the strength beneath her refined exterior. Despite his resolution to maintain professional distance, he was drawn to her in ways that transcended his role as foreman. The realization troubled him deeply, challenging the careful isolation he'd maintained since his parents' deaths. Natalie Randall represented everything he'd avoided for years: attachment, vulnerability, the possibility of devastating loss. The frontier had taught Austin that such connections were dangerous, that survival required emotional independence. Yet for the first time in nearly a decade, he found himself questioning whether survival alone was sufficient, whether the protection of isolation was worth its cost in human connection. As evening approached and they concluded their planning session, Natalie paused at the study door, her expression thoughtful. "Austin," she said, using his first name with rare informality, "whatever happens with Crawford or my father's business, I want you to know that hiring you was the best decision I've made since Richard died. Not just for the ranch, but," she hesitated, then finished simply, "thank you." Before he could respond, she continued down the hallway, leaving Austin to consider the implications of her words and the growing certainty that his carefully maintained defenses were crumbling in the face of something he hadn't sought but could no longer deny. The telegram from Boston arrived 3 days later, delivered by a ranch hand who had been sent to town for supplies. Natalie received the sealed envelope with trepidation, retreating to her study before opening it with trembling fingers. Austin waited in the hallway, respecting her privacy while remaining available should she need support. When the study door opened, Natalie's expression was composed but troubled. She silently handed the telegram to Austin. "Financial situation stable. Stop. No unusual difficulties with shipping company. Stop. Concerned about RUMORS in Montana. Stop. Considering visit to assess situation. Stop. Letter follows. Stop. Father." Austin read the message twice, confirming what he had suspected. "Crawford lied about your father's business troubles." Natalie nodded, returning to her desk chair with a weary sigh. "A fabrication to pressure me into selling. I should have known." "It was a calculated risk on his part," Austin observed. "If you contacted your father directly, the lie would be exposed, but he gambled that you might act based on his information alone." "What concerns me is how readily I doubted my father," Natalie admitted quietly. "Crawford played on existing tensions in our relationship, my father's disapproval of my decision to remain here, his frequent suggestions that I sell and return east." Austin understood the manipulation. Crawford had identified a vulnerability, Natalie's complicated relationship with her father, and exploited it skillfully. It was the tactic of a man who wouldn't hesitate to use any advantage, ethical or otherwise. "The question now is how to respond," Natalie continued, her practical nature reasserting itself. "Crawford expects an answer to his proposal. Refusing outright might provoke more aggressive action." Austin considered the situation carefully. We need time to complete the winter preparations, particularly the north fence line repairs, perhaps a diplomatic delay. Natalie's expression brightened with sudden inspiration. Or a countermove that uses his own tactics against him. What do you have in mind? Crawford values appearances, social standing in the territory. He presents himself as a concerned neighbor offering fair business arrangements. Natalie leaned forward, her blue eyes alight with strategic thinking. What if I responded to his proposal publicly at the Founders' Day celebration next week? Austin caught her intention immediately. With the entire community as witnesses, Crawford couldn't easily dismiss or misconstrue your refusal. Exactly. And the telegraph from my father provides perfect justification for rejecting his offer. Natalie's smile held a hint of satisfaction. Crawford attempted to manipulate me with false information about my family's business. The community should know the kind of man they're dealing with. The plan was bold, perhaps even risky, but Austin admired its directness. Crawford had maneuvered in shadows, spreading rumors and making private threats. Bringing his tactics into the open would undermine his carefully constructed image as a respectable businessman. He won't take public embarrassment lightly, Austin cautioned. Crawford strikes me as a man who holds grudges. I'm counting on it, Natalie replied with unexpected steel. Let him show his true nature where others can witness it. His influence depends partly on the respect of the community. If that's damaged, his power diminishes. Austin studied her with newfound appreciation. Beneath Natalie's refined exterior lay a strategic mind that rivaled Crawford's own. She had adapted to frontier politics more thoroughly than the older rancher realized. It could work, he acknowledged, but we should be prepared for retaliation. Crawford won't simply accept defeat. Natalie's expression sobered. I know. That's why completing our winter preparations quickly is essential. Whatever Crawford attempts next, we need the ranch secure before snow arrives. They spent the remainder of the day reorganizing work schedules, prioritizing the vulnerable north fence line and accelerating hay deliveries. Austin directed extra hands to reinforce outbuildings and check water sources against freezing. If Crawford intended to apply pressure through the coming winter, the rocking R would be ready. As evening approached, Austin found Natalie on the porch, watching the sunset with a pensive expression. He joined her quietly, respecting her contemplative mood. Your father mentioned visiting, he observed after a comfortable silence. How do you feel about that? Natalie sighed softly. Complicated. We've been at odds since Richard died and I chose to stay. Father believes a woman has no business running a cattle ranch, especially not alone. You're proving him wrong, Austin pointed out. Perhaps seeing your success firsthand would change his perspective. Perhaps she didn't sound convinced. Or it might provide more ammunition for his arguments that I should sell and return to civilized society. Austin considered her words. You've never been tempted to return to Boston's comforts. Natalie turned to face him, her expression earnest in the fading light. Not once. This land gets into your blood, doesn't it? The freedom, the challenges, even the dangers, they become part of you. Yes, Austin agreed softly, understanding exactly what she meant. The frontier demanded everything but offered rewards beyond material success, a life lived according to one's own terms, unbound by society's rigid expectations. Besides, Natalie continued with a small smile, I'm no longer the Boston debutante my father remembers. That girl couldn't birth a calf or mend fence lines or negotiate cattle contracts. Austin returned her smile, appreciation warming his voice. No, she became something far more impressive. The compliment brought a faint blush to Natalie's cheeks, visible even in the dimming light. For a moment, they simply gazed at each other, the professional boundaries between them temporarily forgotten. Natalie broke the silence first. Will you accompany me to the Founders' Day celebration? She hesitated, seemingly uncertain of the appropriate term. As the ranch's representative, she finished, though her expression suggested she'd considered other designations. Of course, Austin replied, ignoring the complicated emotions her hesitation had stirred. If you're confronting Crawford publicly, you shouldn't do so alone. Gratitude softened her features. Thank you. Your support has meant more than I can properly express. The simple acknowledgement touched Austin deeply, reinforcing his growing awareness that his commitment to the Rocking R and to Natalie herself had become personal rather than merely professional. Despite his long-held belief in emotional independence, he found himself increasingly invested in her welfare and success. As darkness settled over the ranch and they retreated indoors, Austin contemplated the approaching confrontation with Crawford. The Founders' Day celebration would mark a turning point, not just in Natalie's battle to retain her property, but perhaps in their relationship as well. Public appearances together would generate inevitable speculation in a community where a young widow and her unmarried foreman were already subjects of interest. That night, as Austin prepared for sleep in his quarters, he found himself considering possibilities he'd long dismissed: a permanent home, meaningful connection, a future beyond solitary wandering. The thoughts were both exhilarating and terrifying, challenging everything he'd believed about survival on the frontier. What he couldn't know was that events at the Founders' Day celebration would soon force both him and Natalie to confront not just Crawford's threats but their own deepening feelings for each other, with consequences neither could anticipate. The Founders' Day celebration transformed the small town near the Rocking R, bunting and banners decorating the main street, while tables laden with food filled the area beside the newly constructed town hall. Nearly every family from the surrounding ranches and farms had gathered for the annual event, which commemorated the establishment of the settlement 15 years earlier. Natalie wore her finest dress for the occasion, a deep burgundy creation with modest bustle and lace accents at collar and cuffs. Her honey-blonde hair was arranged in an elegant style that acknowledged both Eastern fashion and Western practicality. As she and Austin drove the Rocking R's wagon into town, she found herself unusually aware of his presence beside her, his clean-shaven profile against the bright autumn sky, the subtle cedar scent of the soap he'd used, the careful attention he paid to the team of horses. For his part, Austin had made a visible effort with his appearance. His usually serviceable attire had been replaced by his best shirt and vest, his boots polished to a respectable shine. The transformation emphasized what Natalie had already recognized. Beneath the working foreman's practical exterior was a strikingly handsome man whose natural dignity required no adornment. They arrived to find the celebration already underway, music from a small band filling the air as townspeople and ranchers mingled in rare harmony. Mayor Prescott, who also owned the town's mercantile, greeted them warmly. "Mrs. Randall, delighted you could join us." His gaze shifted to Austin with approval. "And Mr. Jameson, I've heard good things about the changes at the Rocking R since your arrival." Austin acknowledged the comment with a modest nod. "Mrs. Randall's planning deserves the credit. I'm just implementing her vision." The diplomatic response impressed Natalie. Austin consistently directed recognition toward her leadership, reinforcing her authority in a community that often discounted women's capabilities. "Will you be making remarks during the ceremony?" Prescott asked Natalie. "As one of our largest landowners, your participation would be most welcome." Natalie smiled, recognizing the perfect opening for her strategy. "I would be honored. In fact, I have an announcement that might interest the community." Prescott appeared pleased. "Excellent, we'll have the formal speeches after the midday meal. Crawford will speak first as our most senior rancher, then perhaps you could follow." "Perfect," Natalie agreed, exchanging a meaningful glance with Austin. Following Crawford's remarks would allow her to address his false claims directly, with maximum impact. As Prescott moved away to greet other arrivals, Natalie surveyed the gathering. Crawford was already present, holding court among a group of admiring townspeople, his substantial figure resplendent in an expensive suit that emphasized his prosperity. His son Thomas stood nearby with several young men of similar age, their posture suggesting they'd already visited the whiskey barrel set up behind the livery stable. "Crawford doesn't suspect anything," Austin observed quietly. "He looks entirely too comfortable." Natalie nodded, a mixture of anticipation and anxiety fluttering in her stomach. Let's hope his complacency continues until the speeches. They moved through the crowd, accepting greetings and engaging in the social pleasantries expected at such gatherings. Natalie was acutely conscious of the attention they attracted as a pair, the whispered observations, speculative glances, and occasional knowing smiles from the women present. A young widow and her handsome foreman made natural subjects for gossip, particularly when they arrived together at a community event. Austin seemed oblivious to the speculation, his attention focused primarily on ensuring Natalie's comfort while maintaining awareness of Crawford's location. His protective instincts were evident in small gestures, positioning himself between her and rowdier celebrants, ensuring she had refreshments, quietly steering her away from Thomas Crawford and his increasingly boisterous friends. As the midday meal concluded and people gathered near the town hall steps for the formal portion of the celebration, Natalie felt her resolve strengthening. Crawford had attempted to manipulate her through deception and intimidation. Today she would demonstrate that such tactics would not succeed. Mayor Prescott called for attention, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd, friends and neighbors. Welcome to our 15th annual Founders' Day celebration. Enthusiastic applause greeted this opening, the crowd settling into attentive silence as Prescott delivered a brief history of the settlement's establishment and growth. Austin stood at Natalie's side, his quiet presence providing reassurance as the moment of confrontation approached. And now, Prescott continued, a few words from the man whose investments have done so much to develop our community, Mr. Joseph Crawford of the Lazy Sea Ranch. Crawford ascended the steps with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to public admiration, acknowledging the applause with practiced modesty. His speech began with predictable themes: the territory's progress, the importance of cooperation among neighbors, the bright future awaiting those who persevered through frontier challenges. Then his tone shifted subtly, his gaze finding Natalie in the crowd. Of course, not everyone is equally equipped to face those challenges. The frontier demands strength and resolve that can be overwhelming for those unused to its harsh realities. Murmurs of agreement followed this observation, heads nodding throughout the audience. Crawford continued, his voice carrying concern that Natalie recognized as entirely manufactured. When tragedy strikes, as it sometimes must in this untamed land, we have a responsibility to support those left vulnerable. To offer fair solutions that prevent further hardship. His expression conveyed benevolent wisdom. Sometimes the kindest act is helping others recognize when circumstances require difficult choices, like acknowledging when a burden has become too great to carry alone. The message was clear to anyone familiar with the situation, Crawford presenting himself as a concerned neighbor offering assistance to a struggling widow, rather than a predatory businessman attempting to acquire valuable property through manipulation. Natalie felt Austin tense beside her, his jaw tightening at Crawford's thinly veiled insinuations. She placed a restraining hand lightly on his arm, silently communicating that she would handle the situation as planned. Crawford concluded his remarks with a final platitude about community responsibility, receiving enthusiastic applause as he descended the steps. His self-satisfied expression suggested he believed his public positioning had been effective, establishing a narrative that would make Natalie's eventual surrender of her property seem inevitable rather than coerced. And now, Prescott announced, we're honored to hear from Mrs. Natalie Randall of the Rocking R Ranch, whose late husband was among our earliest settlers. Natalie moved forward with deliberate grace, conscious of all eyes upon her as she took Crawford's place on the steps. Her heart raced, but her voice remained steady as she began. Thank you, Mayor Prescott, and thank you to everyone who worked to make today's celebration possible. She paused, surveying the attentive faces before her. 15 years ago, this settlement was merely a dream, a few determined souls believing that community could flourish even in the wilderness. That same spirit of determination has guided the Rocking R Ranch since my husband and I established it 6 years ago. Supportive murmurs rippled through the crowd. Richard Randall had been well respected in the community, his ambition and work ethic admired even by those who had initially doubted an Easterner's chances of success. When Richard died, Natalie continued, her voice softening, many assumed I would sell the ranch and return east. That I lacked the strength or ability to continue what we had built together. Her gaze found Crawford in the crowd, holding his eyes steadily as she continued. Recently, those assumptions have taken more active forms. There have been offers to purchase the Rocking R, offers presented as generous assistance, but actually representing a fraction of the property's true value. A stir of interest moved through the audience, people exchanging glances and whispered comments. Crawford's expression remained controlled, though a muscle tightened visibly in his jaw. More concerning, Natalie pressed on, her voice gaining strength, these offers have been accompanied by deliberate misinformation. Just last week I was informed that my father's shipping business in Boston faced financial ruin, a situation that supposedly required my immediate consideration of a sale. She withdrew the telegram from her reticule, holding it visibly. I telegraphed my father directly. His business is flourishing, with no financial difficulties whatsoever. The information presented to me was entirely false, a fabrication designed to pressure me into selling valuable property under false pretenses. Gasps and murmurs swept through the crowd, all eyes now moving between Natalie and Crawford, whose face had darkened ominously. I stand before you today to make 3 statements, Natalie declared, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly hushed gathering. First, the Rocking R Ranch is financially sound, with successful cattle operations and a thriving horse breeding program. Second, the property is not for sale at any price. And third, her gaze swept the assembled community members with quiet dignity. I will not be intimidated or manipulated into surrendering what my husband and I built together, neither through false information nor through artificially created obstacles to our operations. The silence that followed her words was profound, broken only when Mayor Prescott stepped forward, clearly attempting to diffuse the tension. Well, thank you, Mrs. Randolph, for those forthright remarks. Perhaps we should move on to...
You accuse me of lying.
Crawford's voice thundered from the crowd, his composure abandoned as he pushed toward the steps. Of fabricating information about your father's business. Natalie met his glare unflinchingly. I state facts, Mr. Crawford. My father's telegram confirms his business faces no difficulties, yet you claimed otherwise, using that falsehood to press for a sale of my property. Crawford's face flushed with anger or embarrassment, perhaps both. My sources provided information they believed accurate. If there was a misunderstanding, it was not deliberate deception. A convenient misunderstanding that served your interests perfectly, Natalie observed, her tone remaining composed despite Crawford's evident fury. Just as the mysteriously appearing dam during our cattle drive was a coincidence, I suppose. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some sympathetic to Natalie's position, others clearly aligned with Crawford's interests. The community was dividing visibly before her eyes, the confrontation forcing people to consider where their loyalties lay. Crawford seemed to realize the damage being done to his carefully cultivated image. With visible effort, he regained a measure of composure. Mrs. Randolph misinterprets concern as conspiracy. My offers have been fair, my motivations honorable. That she chooses to see malice rather than neighborly assistance says more about her state of mind than my actions. It was skillfully done, positioning Natalie as emotionally unstable or irrationally suspicious, a narrative that played into existing prejudices about women's suitability for business leadership. Several heads nodded in agreement with Crawford's characterization, particularly among the older men present. Before Natalie could respond, Austin moved forward, his tall figure commanding immediate attention as he joined her on the steps. The dam that mysteriously appeared overnight on Crawford's property required 3 men several hours to dismantle. That's not coincidence, Mr. Crawford, that's deliberate interference. The direct accusation from a respected ranch foreman carried weight that Natalie's words alone might not have achieved. People exchanged troubled glances, reconsidering the situation in light of Austin's testimony. Crawford's expression darkened further. No one asked for your opinion, Jameson. This is between property owners, not hired hands. The dismissive remark was a tactical error. The crowd included many working men who respected Austin's skills and reputation. Their expressions hardened at Crawford's casual denigration of their social position. Mr. Jameson speaks as the Rocking R's foreman, Natalie interjected smoothly. His observations are relevant and accurate. Mayor Prescott intervened again, his discomfort with the public confrontation evident. Perhaps this discussion would be better continued in private. Today is a celebration of community, after all. I agree entirely, Natalie replied with genuine warmth. My intention was simply to clarify the Rocking R's position and correct misinformation that has been circulating. The ranch is thriving, not failing. It is not for sale. And I intend to continue the work my husband and I began together, with the capable assistance of Mr. Jameson and our dedicated hands." With that clear statement, she stepped down, allowing Prescott to continue the formal program. Austin remained at her side as they moved through the crowd, which parted with a mixture of admiration and speculation. She had made her position unmistakably clear, challenging Crawford's narrative in the most public forum available. The consequences remained to be seen. Crawford watched their retreat with barely concealed fury, his carefully constructed image as a benevolent community leader significantly damaged by Natalie's revelations. His son Thomas and several hired hands gathered around him, their expressions suggesting that the confrontation might not end with mere public embarrassment. "You handled that perfectly," Austin murmured as they reached a relatively quiet corner of the gathering. Clear, dignified, impossible to dismiss. Natalie released a shaky breath, the tension of the confrontation catching up with her now that it had passed. Crawford won't forgive this public challenge. "We should prepare for retaliation." Austin nodded grimly. "We'll head back to the ranch soon. I don't like the way Thomas and those hands are gathering." His concern proved prescient. As they made their way toward their wagon an hour later, having fulfilled the minimum social obligations required by courtesy, Thomas Crawford intercepted them, his young face flushed with whiskey and indignation. "That was quite a performance, Mrs. Randall," he slurred, positioning himself to block their path. "Father says you've always had a flair for drama, must be that Boston upbringing." Austin moved slightly forward, his stance protective without being overtly aggressive. "Step aside, Thomas, Mrs. Randall is leaving." The younger Crawford ignored him, his attention fixed on Natalie. "You think you've won something today, making father look bad in front of these farmers and shopkeepers," he laughed unpleasantly. "The lazy sea doesn't need their approval to get what it wants." "Is that a threat, Mr. Crawford?" Natalie asked coolly, refusing to show the anxiety his words provoked. Thomas swayed slightly, alcohol having loosened his tongue beyond prudence. "It's a promise. Father always says a smart opponent knows when they're beaten. Too bad you're not smart, just stubborn." Austin had heard enough. He moved decisively between Thomas and Natalie, his voice carrying quiet authority. "You're drunk, Thomas. Go sleep it off before you say something your father will regret even more than your current behavior." The younger man's expression contorted with resentment. "Don't tell me what to do, Jameson. You're nothing but a drifter who got lucky with an employer too naive to see through you." The insinuation wasn't lost on either Natalie or Austin. Thomas was suggesting impropriety in their relationship, a common tactic against widows who maintained independence rather than remarrying. Austin's expression hardened dangerously. "Apologize to Mrs. Randall." "Now," Thomas sneered, emboldened by alcohol and the presence of his friends nearby. "For what? Speaking the truth everyone in town whispers about, the pretty widow and her conveniently handsome foreman living alone on that big ranch." He never finished the sentence. Austin's hand shot out, gripping the front of Thomas's expensive shirt and pulling him close, his voice low but carrying unmistakable warning. "That's enough. Apologize to Mrs. Randall, or I'll make you regret your lack of manners in ways your father's money can't fix." Fear flickered briefly through Thomas's alcohol-hazed eyes, a sudden recognition that he'd pushed too far. Behind him, his friends shifted uncertainly, unwilling to challenge Austin directly despite their numerical advantage. "Easy, Jameson," Thomas managed, attempting to maintain some dignity despite his precarious position. "Just having some fun, no offense intended to the lady." Austin released him with a slight push that sent Thomas stumbling backward. "Get on home, Thomas, and suggest to your father that sending drunk boys to do a man's intimidation is poor strategy." The pointed criticism of Joseph Crawford's tactics hit its mark. Thomas flushed with humiliation but recognized he was outmatched in the current confrontation. With a final muttered obscenity, he retreated to where his friends waited, all of them departing with a show of indifference that fooled no one. Natalie released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you. Though I fear you've just added personal antagonism to what was already a difficult situation." Austin helped her into the wagon before climbing up beside her. Thomas crossed a line. Allowing such insinuations to pass unchallenged would only encourage worse behavior. As they drove away from town, Natalie was acutely aware of the eyes following their departure, the speculation and gossip that would inevitably follow Thomas's drunken accusations. Austin had defended her honor admirably, but in doing so had drawn attention to the very relationship Thomas had crudely insinuated. "People will talk," she said quietly as the town receded behind them. "About us, I mean." "What Thomas suggested." Austin's hands tightened slightly on the reins. "People always talk. It doesn't make their speculation true or relevant." But it was relevant, Natalie thought, though not in the way Thomas had implied. Her feelings for Austin had evolved far beyond the professional relationship of employer and employee. She valued his counsel, respected his skills, and increasingly found herself drawn to him as a man, his quiet strength, his inherent decency, the unspoken pain that had shaped him. Such feelings were inappropriate, she knew. Austin was her employee, dependent on her for his livelihood. Any hint of personal involvement would create impossible complications, particularly given the existing tensions with Crawford and the ranch's vulnerable position. Yet as they rode in companionable silence, the autumn sun warming their shoulders, Natalie couldn't deny the comfort she took in Austin's presence, the sense of security and partnership that transcended professional considerations. What she couldn't know was that Austin's thoughts followed a similar path, his own carefully maintained emotional boundaries increasingly strained by feelings he hadn't sought and couldn't easily dismiss. The confrontation with Thomas had triggered protective instincts that went beyond duty, exposing emotions Austin had believed long buried after his parents' deaths. As the rocking R appeared on the horizon, both realized independently that something had shifted during the day's events. The public confrontation with Crawford had not only escalated the external threats to the ranch, but had also brought their unacknowledged feelings for each other closer to the surface, a development neither was prepared to address directly. Yet circumstances would soon force that reckoning, as Crawford's response to his public humiliation took forms more dangerous than either Natalie or Austin could anticipate. The first snow of the season arrived a week after the Founders' Day celebration, dusting the rocking R with white that would likely melt by midday, but served as a reminder that winter approached in earnest. Austin supervised the final preparations, ensuring hay storage was adequate, checking that all cattle had been moved to sheltered pastures, confirming the outbuildings were secure against harsher weather to come. The confrontation with Crawford had resulted in an uneasy silence from the neighboring ranch. No further offers had arrived, no representatives had appeared at the property line, not even the usual observers on the ridge. The absence of visible pressure was more concerning than continued harassment might have been, suggesting Crawford was planning something beyond his previous tactics. Natalie shared Austin's unease, though she maintained outward calm as she managed the ranch's business affairs. Her telegram exchange with her father had resulted in a lengthy letter, which arrived 4 days after the Founders' Day incident. William Randall expressed concern about Crawford's false claims regarding his business but stopped short of supporting Natalie's defiance. Instead, he renewed his suggestion that she consider selling the ranch and returning to Boston, where he could ensure her future security. "He still doesn't understand," Natalie confided to Austin as they reviewed breeding records in her study that evening. "Father sees the ranch as merely property, an investment that can be replaced. He can't comprehend what it means to me." Austin understood perfectly. The rocking R represented not just financial assets but Natalie's independence, her partnership with Richard, her hard-won place in the frontier community. Selling would mean surrendering all of that, returning to a life that no longer fit who she had become. "Will he visit, as he mentioned in the telegram?" Austin asked, curious about the man who had raised such a determined daughter yet seemed unable to recognize her strength. Natalie sighed, setting aside the breeding ledger. "He suggests he might come in spring, once the eastern shipping season concludes. I suspect he hopes winter hardships might make me more receptive to his arguments for selling." "He underestimates your resilience," Austin observed quietly. A smile touched Natalie's lips, as most men do, including initially you. Austin acknowledged the gentle accusation with a nod. I've learned better since then." Their eyes met across the desk, holding for a moment longer than strictly professional interaction required. Such moments had become increasingly frequent in recent days, brief connections that suggested deeper feelings neither had openly acknowledged. Natalie broke the gaze first, returning her attention to the ledgers with deliberate focus. "The Morgan Stallion has produced excellent foals this season. His bloodline will significantly improve our breeding stock." Austin accepted the return to business matters, recognizing the wisdom in maintaining professional boundaries despite the growing attraction between them. The ranch's situation remained precarious, with Crawford's next move unknown but certainly forthcoming. Personal complications would only add vulnerability to an already challenging position. Yet later that night, as Austin checked the property before retiring, he found himself pausing to observe Natalie through the study window. She sat at her desk, golden hair catching the lamplight as she reviewed correspondence, her expression reflecting the quiet determination that had impressed him since their first meeting. Something tightened in his chest at the sight, an emotion he had denied himself for years, growing despite his best efforts to contain it. The sound of approaching horses snapped Austin from his thoughts, his hand moving instinctively to the revolver at his hip as he scanned the darkness. 3 riders emerged from the shadows, moving at a deliberate pace that suggested purpose rather than casual visitation. Austin recognized the lead figure immediately, Jim Phillips, Natalie's former foreman, now employed by Crawford. The men with him were strangers, their posture suggesting the casual confidence of hired guns rather than regular ranch hands. Moving quickly to the main house, Austin entered without knocking, finding Natalie still at her desk. "Phillips is here with 2 men I don't recognize," he reported tersely. "They don't look friendly." Alarm flickered across Natalie's features, quickly replaced by resolve as she rose. "Crawford's making his move, then." A knock at the front door confirmed Austin's assessment. He positioned himself slightly ahead of Natalie as she moved to answer it, his stance protective without being overtly aggressive. Philip stood on the porch, his expression uncomfortable beneath a forced confidence. The men behind him remained mounted, their hands resting too casually near holstered weapons. "Mrs. Randall," Phillips began, removing his hat with a semblance of courtesy. "Apologies for the late hour." "What do you want, Jim?" Natalie asked directly, making no move to invite him inside. Phillips shifted his weight, glancing briefly at Austin before continuing. "Mr. Crawford sent me with a message. He's reconsidered his previous offer in light of recent events." "And," Natalie prompted when he hesitated, "he's prepared to increase his offer by 15%, provided you agree to preliminary terms by the end of the week." Phillips reached into his coat, withdrawing an envelope. "The details are all here." Natalie made no move to accept the envelope. "Crawford knows my position. The ranch isn't for sale at any price." Phillips looked genuinely regretful. "Mrs. Randall, I worked for you for 3 years. I respect what you've built here, but Crawford isn't a man who takes refusal well, especially after what happened at Founders Day." "Is that a threat?" Austin asked quietly. Phillips addressed Natalie rather than Austin, his discomfort increasing visibly. "It's advice from someone who knows the situation. Crawford has connections throughout the territory, merchants, bankers, transporters. He can make operations very difficult for those who oppose him. So he's moving from direct pressure to economic isolation," Natalie observed with calm analysis that impressed Austin. "Attempting to cut off our business relationships." Phillips didn't deny it. "Consider the offer, Mrs. Randall. It's more generous than you're likely to receive if circumstances deteriorate." Natalie's posture remained composed, her voice steady. "Thank you for the delivery, Jim. You can tell Mr. Crawford that my answer remains unchanged. The rocking R is not for sale." The former foreman sighed, tucking the rejected envelope back into his coat. "I expected as much. For what it's worth, I hope you reconsider." As he turned to leave, one of the mounted men leaned forward slightly. "Crawford also said to remind you about winter supply lines, ma'am. Heavy snow can make deliveries mighty unpredictable. Might want to stock up while you can." The implied threat was unmistakable. Crawford intended to interfere with the ranch's access to necessary supplies during the coming winter, a potentially serious problem if implemented effectively. Your concern is noted, Austin replied coldly. Good night, gentlemen. Once the riders had departed and the door was closed, Natalie released a shaky breath. Crawford's escalating just as we feared. Austin nodded grimly. The supply threat is concerning. We should increase our reserves immediately before he can pressure Prescott and the other merchants. I'll go to town tomorrow, Natalie decided. Prescott respects our business relationship. If I speak with him directly, he might resist Crawford's influence, at least regarding essential supplies. I'll accompany you, Austin stated, his tone brooking no argument. Crawford's men will be watching. You shouldn't travel alone. Natalie didn't object, recognizing the practical wisdom in his suggestion rather than merely protective concern. We should also consider alternative supply sources. Fort Benton might be an option, though the distance is considerable. They spent the next hour developing contingency plans, identifying potential vulnerabilities and strategies to address them. The easy collaboration that had developed between them over the past months served them well now, each contributing insights from their respective experiences. As they concluded their planning session, Natalie hesitated at the study door. Austin, she said quietly, using his first name with an intimacy that had become more frequent in private conversations, do you think we can win this, against Crawford and his influence? The question held vulnerability she rarely displayed, a momentary glimpse behind the composed exterior she maintained for the ranch hands and the community. Austin considered his response carefully, knowing platitudes would be both ineffective and unwelcome. I think Crawford underestimates what he's facing, he finally said. He sees a young widow who should be easily intimidated, not a woman who has already overcome greater challenges than his pressure tactics. And he certainly doesn't understand what the ranch means to you, that it's not just property but purpose. Natalie's expression softened, appreciation warming her blue eyes. Thank you for that. And for standing with me through this fight. Where else would I be? The question emerged before Austin could consider its implications, revealing more than he had intended. Something shifted in Natalie's gaze, a recognition of the sentiment behind his words, perhaps, or an acknowledgement of the connection that had grown between them, despite their mutual attempts to maintain professional distance. Good night, Austin, she said softly. We'll face tomorrow's challenges when they arrive. As she disappeared down the hallway toward her bedroom, Austin remained in the study doorway, confronting emotions he had denied for nearly a decade. The protective walls he had built after his parents' deaths, the belief that attachment inevitably led to devastating loss, were crumbling in the face of his growing feelings for Natalie Randall. The realization terrified him nearly as much as it exhilarated him, suggesting possibilities he had long believed close to a man determined to remain emotionally independent. Yet Crawford's escalating pressure created practical obstacles to exploring those possibilities. The ranch's survival had to remain their primary focus, personal feelings notwithstanding. With these complicated thoughts swirling in his mind, Austin completed his nightly security checks and retired to his quarters. Tomorrow would bring new challenges in their struggle against Crawford's influence, requiring clear thinking and decisive action rather than emotional distraction. What neither Natalie nor Austin could anticipate was how Crawford's next move would force them to confront not just external threats but their deepest fears and most closely guarded vulnerabilities, with consequences that would transform their relationship irrevocably. The journey to town the following morning revealed the first evidence of Crawford's influence. As Natalie and Austin approached the settlement, they noticed unusual activity around Prescott's mercantile, wagons being loaded with supplies, men working with unusual urgency for a typical business day. Something's happening, Austin observed, his expression concerned as he guided their wagon toward the store. Inside, they found Mayor Prescott directing employees in what appeared to be inventory consolidation, shelves being cleared and goods packed into crates. He looked up at their entrance, his normally jovial expression replaced by evident discomfort. Mrs. Randall, he greeted Natalie with forced cordiality, what brings you to town today? We need to increase our winter supplies, Natalie replied, studying the activity with growing concern. What's happening here, Mr. Prescott? You appear to be closing. The merchant hesitated, glancing toward Austin before responding. Not closing precisely. Reorganizing. You see, I've entered a business arrangement with Mr. Crawford.
He's investing in expanding our operation. Understanding dawned immediately. Crawford had moved faster than anticipated, securing influence over the primary supply source in the settlement. I see, Natalie said carefully. And does this new arrangement affect your ability to fill the Rocking R's orders? Prescott's discomfort increased visibly. Not entirely. Basic necessities remain available to all customers, of course. But premium items, larger quantities, he spread his hands apologetically. Those require Mr. Crawford's approval during this transition period. Crawford is using his money to control who gets supplies, Austin stated bluntly, cutting through the merchant's careful phrasing. Prescott didn't deny it. Business decisions, Mr. Jameson, nothing personal. Mr. Crawford's investment allows improvements that benefit the entire community. At the cost of independent operations like ours, Natalie observed, maintaining her composure despite the seriousness of the development. What specifically can we purchase today, Mr. Prescott? The merchant consulted a list on his desk, another sign that Crawford's control was already firmly established. Standard household necessities, limited ammunition. No bulk grain or specialty items without prior approval. Natalie met Austin's gaze, silent communication passing between them. The restrictions would create significant challenges for the ranch's winter operations, exactly as Crawford had intended. We'll take whatever you're permitted to sell us, Natalie decided, her voice revealing none of the concern Austin knew she must feel, and we would appreciate information about when this transition period might conclude. Prescott's expression suggested the arrangement was more permanent than temporary. Mr. Crawford's investment is substantial, Mrs. Randall. The associated conditions are likely to remain in place for the foreseeable future. They departed an hour later with far fewer supplies than planned, the wagon carrying only basic necessities rather than the comprehensive winter stores Natalie had intended to purchase. As they drove away from the settlement, Austin could see the strain beneath her composed exterior. Crawford moved quickly, she observed, gazing at the meager supplies in the wagon bed. I underestimated how rapidly he could establish control over local commerce. Austin nodded grimly. He's been planning this since the Founders' Day confrontation. Prescott was likely approached immediately afterward. We need to find alternative supply sources, Natalie concluded, practical as always despite the setback. Fort Benton is the obvious choice, though the journey becomes increasingly difficult as winter progresses. I'll organize an expedition immediately, Austin decided. We can take 2 wagons, bring back enough supplies to last through the worst of the season. Natalie considered this plan, then shook her head slightly. Not you, Austin. The ranch needs your leadership, especially with Crawford escalating his pressure. Send Hodges with 2 reliable men. You're more valuable at the Rocking R. The rational argument made sense, yet Austin found himself reluctant to remain behind while others undertook the potentially dangerous journey. Winter travel carried significant risks, and Crawford's influence might extend to Fort Benton as well. Hodges is experienced, he acknowledged, but this mission is critical to the ranch's survival. I should lead it personally. Natalie studied him with unexpected perception. You're concerned about my safety if you're away. The direct assessment caught Austin off guard. Crawford has demonstrated he's willing to use increasingly aggressive tactics. Your security is a legitimate consideration. I managed before you arrived, Natalie reminded him gently, and the ranch hands are loyal. I'll be safe enough for the week it takes to reach Fort Benton and return. Austin recognized the wisdom in her approach, though his protective instincts rebelled against the separation. Very well, I'll prepare Hodges and select the men today. They can depart tomorrow at first light. As they continued toward the ranch, snow began falling again, heavier than the previous day's dusting. The weather underscored the urgency of securing adequate supplies before winter isolated the property completely. Crawford thinks he's found our vulnerability, Natalie observed, watching the snowflakes gather on the wagon's wooden sides, limiting our access to necessities, forcing dependence that he can leverage for the property. It's an effective strategy, Austin admitted, but not insurmountable. Once we establish alternative supply lines, his primary advantage disappears. Natalie nodded, though her expression remained troubled. I wonder what my father would advise in this situation. He built his shipping business facing similar tactics from established competitors. What would Richard have done? Austin asked, curious about the man whose vision had created the ranch they now fought to preserve. A fond smile touched Natalie's lips, something unexpectedly bold, probably. Richard believed in meeting challenges directly, finding opportunities in obstacles. Her expression grew wistful. He would have enjoyed outwitting Crawford. Turning the situation to our advantage somehow. Austin considered this insight. Crawford expects you to eventually capitulate as supplies dwindle. What he doesn't anticipate is resourcefulness, finding alternative solutions beyond his influence. Exactly, Natalie's smile strengthened with renewed determination. We need to think beyond merely sustaining through winter. How can we emerge stronger, perhaps even expand operations in ways Crawford hasn't considered? The strategic conversation continued as they reached the ranch, both finding renewed purpose in developing plans that went beyond mere survival. By the time they unloaded the limited supplies, Hodges had been briefed on the Fort Benton expedition, and preparations were underway for departure the following morning. That evening, as snow continued falling outside, Austin found Natalie on the porch, wrapped in a heavy shawl as she watched the transformation of the landscape. He joined her silently, respecting her contemplative mood. I've always loved the first heavy snow, she said without turning, the way it changes everything familiar into something new and beautiful. Austin followed her gaze across the whitened yard, understanding the sentiment. The snow smoothed the ranch's rugged edges, covering imperfections beneath a pristine blanket that unified disparate elements into harmonious whole. Richard proposed to me during the first snowfall after we met, Natalie continued, her voice soft with memory. He said a Boston girl needed to understand what she was agreeing to, that Montana winters were beautiful but demanding, like the life we would build together. The personal revelation surprised Austin. Natalie rarely spoke of Richard in such intimate terms, particularly to him. He remained silent, allowing her to continue if she wished. He was right, of course. Her gaze remained on the falling snow. The beauty and the hardship are inseparable here. You can't have one without accepting the other. Would you change your decision? Austin asked quietly, knowing what you know now, the struggles, the loss, this fight with Crawford. Natalie turned to face him, snowflakes catching in her golden hair like diamonds. Not for a moment. This life, this place, it's part of me now. The difficulties have shaped me as much as the joys. Her words resonated deeply with Austin, reflecting his own experience of frontier existence. The West demanded everything but offered freedom and purpose impossible to find in more civilized settings. Crawford doesn't understand that, he observed. He sees the ranch as merely property to be acquired. He can't comprehend what it represents to you. No, Natalie agreed softly, just as my father can't understand why I refuse to return to Boston. They measure value in dollars and social position, not in meaning or purpose. The insight revealed much about Natalie's determination to maintain the ranch despite mounting pressure. For her, surrender would mean betraying not just Richard's memory but her own hard-won identity as a frontier woman rather than a Boston socialite. They stood in companionable silence as darkness deepened and snow continued falling. Austin became increasingly aware of Natalie's presence beside him, the subtle lavender scent that somehow persisted despite the practical demands of ranch life, the graceful profile illuminated by lamplight spilling from the window, the strength and vulnerability that coexisted in her slender figure. I'm glad you're here, Austin, she said suddenly, her voice barely audible above the hushed sounds of falling snow. Not just for the ranch, but, she hesitated, then continued with quiet honesty, for me. These past months would have been unbearable alone. The admission held deeper meaning than mere appreciation for his professional services. Austin felt something shift between them, boundaries weakening, possibilities emerging that had remained unacknowledged despite growing attraction. Natalie, he began, using her first name with rare deliberateness, I. The moment was interrupted by approaching footsteps, Hodges coming to report on preparations for the following day's expedition. Austin stepped back slightly, the professional mask returning as the older cowboy joined them on the porch. "Everything's ready for morning, ma'am," Hodges reported, seemingly oblivious to the intimate moment his arrival had disrupted. "Riley and Peters will accompany me. We should reach Fort Benton in 3 days if the weather holds." "Thank you, Ben," Natalie replied, her composure perfectly restored. "Take no unnecessary risks. If the snow worsens, seek shelter rather than pushing forward." After discussing final details of the supply list, Hodges departed, leaving Austin and Natalie alone again on the snow-covered porch. The interrupted moment had passed, however, the professional relationship reasserting itself as they reviewed practical matters rather than personal feelings. Yet as they said goodnight and Austin watched Natalie return to the main house, he recognized that something fundamental had changed. The walls he had maintained since his parents' deaths, the emotional distance he had cultivated as protection against loss, were crumbling in the face of feelings he could no longer deny. What he couldn't anticipate was how soon those feelings would be tested by circumstances neither he nor Natalie could foresee, challenges that would force them to confront not just Crawford's escalating pressure but their own deepest fears and most closely guarded hearts. Hodges and his men departed at dawn, 2 wagons creaking through fresh snow toward Fort Benton and the supplies essential for the ranch's winter survival. Austin watched them disappear into the whitened landscape, concern mingling with determination as he turned his attention to securing the property against both weather and potential interference from Crawford. The following days established a new routine at the Rocking R with several experienced hands accompanying the supply expedition. Those who remained worked longer hours, ensuring animals were properly sheltered and fed as temperatures dropped and snow continued accumulating. Austin divided his time between physical labor alongside the men and strategic planning, with Natalie developing contingencies for various scenarios that might unfold as winter progressed. 4 days after Hodges' departure, the weather deteriorated significantly. What had been steady snowfall intensified into a proper blizzard, winds howling around buildings and visibility reduced to mere yards beyond the windows. Austin doubled the watch on the livestock, concerned about animals straying in the whiteout conditions and succumbing to the plummeting temperatures. By evening, the storm had reached frightening intensity. Natalie paced the study, her usual composure strained as she gazed periodically through windows that revealed nothing but swirling white darkness. "They'd have sought shelter," Austin assured her, knowing her thoughts were with Hodges and his men, somewhere between the ranch and Fort Benton. "Ben's too experienced to risk traveling in these conditions." Natalie nodded, though worry remained evident in her expression. "I'm concerned about the north pasture herd. That fence line was still being reinforced when the snow began." "I checked it yesterday," Austin replied. "The repairs were sufficient to contain the cattle, and they have access to the windbreak along the creek bed. They'll weather the storm." His calm competence seemed to reassure her. Natalie settled into the chair behind her desk, the firelight catching gold highlights in her honey-blonde hair. This is exactly the situation Crawford hoped to create, the ranch isolated, supplies limited, pressure mounting as winter deepens. "He doesn't understand who he's dealing with," Austin observed with quiet confidence. "You've faced worse challenges than this storm or Crawford's manipulations." A small smile touched Natalie's lips. "Your faith in me is heartening, if perhaps excessive." "Not excessive," Austin contradicted gently, "based on evidence. I've watched you manage this ranch through cattle drives, neighbor disputes, and staff challenges. Crawford thinks you'll break under pressure. I know better." The simple declaration held more emotion than Austin had intended to reveal. Natalie's eyes met his, recognition dawning of feelings that had developed beyond professional respect or casual friendship. Before either could acknowledge the moment, a commotion erupted outside, shouting voices barely audible above the storm's howl. Austin moved immediately to the window, straining to see through the snow-blurred glass. "Someone's arrived," he reported, already reaching for his coat. "Stay inside until I determine who it is." The protective instruction might once have provoked Natalie's independent streak, but the seriousness of the situation warranted caution. She nodded, moving to retrieve the shotgun kept in the study cabinet, a precaution that spoke volumes about the tension Crawford's pressure had created. Austin braced himself as he stepped onto the porch, the wind's force nearly staggering him as snow and ice particles stung his face. Shielding his eyes, he made out several figures approaching from the barn, ranch hands supporting what appeared to be an injured man between them. "What happened?" Austin called, moving to assist as they struggled toward the house. Ryder collapsed at the edge of the property, one hand shouted above the wind, "Nearly frozen, horse is dead." As they reached the porch light's meager illumination, Austin recognized the semi-conscious man with shock. "It's Thomas Crawford." Natalie appeared in the doorway, shotgun lowered but still present. Her expression registered surprise equal to Austin's as she took in the identity of their unexpected visitor. "Bring him inside," she directed without hesitation, near the fire. The decision to aid Joseph Crawford's son, despite all the family had done to threaten the ranch, came without apparent deliberation. It was simply the frontier code. No one was refused shelter in life-threatening weather, regardless of personal conflicts. They settled Thomas before the study fireplace, his clothes sodden with melted snow, and his young face alarmingly pale beneath a layer of ice crystals in his beard and hair. He was barely conscious, mumbling incoherently as Natalie directed the removal of his frozen outer garments and their replacement with warm blankets. What was he doing out in this storm? She wondered aloud as she examined him for frostbite. "The lazy sea is hours away in good weather." Austin shook his head, equally baffled by the young man's presence. Whatever brought him here was urgent enough to risk death. His horse didn't survive the journey. Thomas stirred as warmth gradually penetrated his frozen limbs, his eyes focusing with difficulty on the faces around him. Recognition dawned slowly, confusion evident as he realized where he was. "Mrs. Randall," he croaked, voice hoarse from exposure. "Don't try to speak yet," Natalie advised, offering a cup of hot tea laced with medicinal whiskey. "You're suffering from severe exposure. Rest and warmth are essential now." Thomas pushed himself up despite her caution, urgent purpose overriding physical distress. "No time," he insisted, accepting the cup with trembling hands. "Father. He's planning tonight." Austin stepped closer, intuition suggesting Thomas's presence related directly to their ongoing conflict with Crawford. "What is your father planning, Thomas?" The younger Crawford took a shuddering breath, conflict evident in his expression, loyalty to his father warring with whatever purpose had driven him through the blizzard. "The north fence line," he finally managed. "He sent men to cut it. Drive your cattle off the property in the storm. They'll scatter, die in the ravines." Natalie's face paled at the implications. Cattle driven from shelter in such weather would indeed perish, representing not just financial loss but unnecessary suffering for the animals. "When?" Austin demanded, already moving toward his coat. "Tonight, during the storm." When no one would see, Thomas coughed violently, still dangerously chilled despite the fire's warmth. "I tried to stop him, said it was wrong. Animals shouldn't suffer for property disputes and revenge." The raw honesty in Thomas's voice banished any lingering doubts. Austin was already moving, grabbing his heavy coat and scarf from the hook by the door. "I'll rouse the men," he told Natalie, his voice sharp with command. "If we ride hard, we might beat them to the ridge. Keep Thomas here. He's your witness if this goes legal." "Austin," Natalie said, her voice trembling slightly as she caught his arm. "It's a whiteout." "The risk." "If we lose the herd, you lose the ranch," he said, his eyes locking with hers. He reached out, his gloved hand cupping her cheek for a fleeting second, a breach of protocol he no longer cared about. "I won't let that happen, I promise." He turned and vanished into the howling white void. The next 4 hours were a blur of freezing wind and adrenaline. Austin led Hodges and 4 other hands through the blindness of the storm, navigating by instinct and memory toward the north pasture. The cold was a physical weight pressing against their chests, freezing eyelashes shut, turning fingers to clumsy blocks of wood. They reached the ridge just as shadowy figures began working on the wire fencing. The sound of wire cutters snapping was swallowed by the wind, but the intent was clear. "Spread out," Austin shouted to his men. "Fire warning shots only unless fired upon." The confrontation was chaotic and brief. Crawford's hired men, expecting an unguarded ranch and blinded by the storm, panicked at the sudden appearance of the rocking R riders. 2 surrendered immediately, throwing their hands up in the swirling snow. The others scattered, fleeing back toward the lazy sea, abandoning their task. Austin and his men spent the remainder of the night patrolling the line, repairing the breach, and driving the spooked cattle back into the shelter of the draw. By the time dawn broke, a gray, frozen light filtering through the dissipating storm, Austin was exhausted, frozen to the marrow, but triumphant. The herd was safe. They returned to the ranch house as the sun finally crested the mountains, casting a brilliant, blinding light on the fresh snow. As they rode into the yard, Austin saw a familiar carriage waiting, Joseph Crawford's. The older rancher stood on the porch, pounding on the door, demanding entry. He looked furious, likely having heard from his fleeing men that the sabotage had failed. Austin dismounted, his legs stiff, and walked toward the porch, his hand resting on his Colt. "Crawford," he barked. Joseph spun around. "Jameson, I'm here to speak with Mrs. Randall. I've heard disturbing reports that your men attacked my employees who were merely checking the fence line." "They were cutting wire, Joseph," a weak voice said from the doorway. Crawford froze, the door opened, and Natalie stepped out, supporting a pale, blanket-wrapped Thomas. "Thomas," Crawford whispered, the color draining from his face. What are you doing here?" "I came to stop you," the son said, his voice raspy but firm. "I couldn't let you kill the herd, Father. It wasn't right." "You traitor," Crawford hissed, stepping forward, his hand raised. Austin was there in a heartbeat, stepping between father and son, his chest heaving, his eyes cold as the winter sky. "You touch him or her," Austin said, his voice low and dangerous, "and I will forget that I am a civilized man." Crawford looked at Austin, then at his son, and finally at Natalie, who stood tall and defiant in the morning light. He saw the ranch hands gathering behind Austin, hands on their weapons. He saw the defeat in his son's eyes. "Get your wagon," Crawford spat at Thomas. "You're no son of mine." "He stays," Natalie said firmly, "until the doctor clears him. And until he speaks to the sheriff about attempted property destruction and animal cruelty." Crawford sneered, but the fight had gone out of him. He knew that with his own son as a witness, his reputation and his legal standing were in tatters. He turned and walked to his carriage, a diminished figure in the vast landscape, and drove away without looking back. The following days were a flurry of activity. The sheriff took statements, the town buzzed with the scandal, and the threat to the rocking R dissolved like snow in spring. Thomas recovered and eventually moved to Fort Benton to start fresh, away from his father's shadow. But for Austin, the victory felt hollow. The crisis had passed, the ranch was secure, Natalie was safe, and that meant his job was done. He spent a week finalizing the winter schedules, repairing equipment, and avoiding the main house. He told himself it was to give Natalie space, but he knew the truth. He was pulling away before he could be sent away. He was a drifter, a poor cowboy. She was a wealthy landowner. The adrenaline of the fight had blurred the lines between them, but the quiet of peace had drawn them back in sharp relief. On a Tuesday evening, he knocked on the study door. "Come in," Natalie called. She was at her desk, looking over the accounts. She smiled when she saw him, a warm, unguarded expression that made his chest ache. "Austin, I was just going over the figures. We're going to turn a profit this year, despite everything." "That's good news," he said, remaining by the door, hat in hands. "The ranch is in good shape, Mrs. Randall. The men respect you. The neighbors won't bother you again." Natalie put down her pen, her smile fading slightly. "Why does this sound like a goodbye?" "I've done what I was hired to do," Austin said, staring at the brim of his hat. "I upheld the contract. The drive is done, the threat is gone. And it's time for me to move on." He forced himself to look at her. "There's work in Wyoming. I hear the herds are moving early." Natalie stood up slowly. She walked around the desk and crossed the room, stopping just inches from him. "Is that what you want, to move on?" "It's what's best," he said, his voice tight. "I'm a foreman, Natalie. You're the owner of the rocking R. We both know how this territory works. I can't give you the life you were raised for. I can't give you Boston." "I don't want Boston," she whispered. She reached out and took his hat from his hands, setting it on the side table. Then she took his rough, calloused hands in her soft ones. "Do you remember what I told you about courage?" she asked. "That it's daring to create something beautiful despite the hardships." "I remember." "I'm trying to create something beautiful right now, Austin Jameson," she said, her eyes shining with tears. "But you're making it very difficult by trying to leave." "Natalie, I have nothing," he choked out. "No land, no money, just a saddle and a horse." "You saved my home," she said fiercely. "You saved my dignity, you saved me. You have more worth in your little finger than Joseph Crawford has in his entire bank account." She stepped closer, looking up into his face. "I don't need a foreman anymore, Austin. I need a partner. I need someone who knows what it is to lose everything and chooses to build anyway. I need you." The walls he had built for 8 years, the walls that kept him safe, kept him moving, kept him alone, shattered completely. "I love you," he confessed, the words tearing out of him. "I've loved you since the cattle drive, maybe since the first day." "Then stop drifting," she said, "and come home." He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her neck, holding her with the desperate strength of a man who had finally found the one thing he couldn't survive without. When he kissed her, it wasn't the tentative kiss of a hopeful suitor, but the claiming seal of a man who had finally staked his claim. 5 years later, the sun was setting over the rocking R, casting long golden shadows across the expanded pastures where 500 head of cattle grazed. Austin stood on the porch, watching a toddler navigate the steps with wobbling determination. "Careful, Richard," he murmured, ready to catch the boy. "He's fine," Natalie said, coming out to stand beside him, a newborn resting against her shoulder. "He has his father's balance." Austin smiled, wrapping his arm around his wife's waist. He looked out over the valley at the thriving herd, the peaceful borders, the life they had built from grit and determination. He thought of the boy who had ridden onto this ranch with nothing but a bedroll and a fear of attachment. That boy was gone. In his place was a man who knew that the greatest wealth on the frontier wasn't in the land or the cattle, it was in the hand he held and the home they had made together. "What are you thinking?" Natalie asked, leaning her head on his shoulder. Austin kissed her temple. "Just thinking that I'm the luckiest poor cowboy who ever lived." Natalie laughed, the sound ringing clear and sweet in the evening air. "You're not poor, my loves, you never were." And as the stars came out over Montana, Austin Jameson finally believed her.